Hello friend, welcome to Sleepy Old World. Settle in, get comfortable. Because tonight we're stepping into the Roaring Twenties, into everything the wealthiest women in America did without a second thought. The things that raised absolutely no eyebrows at the time and would get you arrested, fired or talked about for weeks if you tried a single one of them today. Doctors legally prescribing whiskey to get around their own country's laws. Women binding their own chest flat on purpose every single morning. A 6-week trip to Nevada that could legally end a marriage for good. We're going to walk through a great many of these tonight, slowly, one at a time, folded into the story of one particular woman's very ordinary, very extraordinary day. Just a small moment before we begin. If these gentle evenings have become a comfort to you, subscribing would mean more than you know. And if tonight helps ease your mind towards sleep, a like really does keep this little channel going, tell me in the comments where you're curled up tonight. Maybe with the air conditioning humming low somewhere in Chicago, or wrapped in a blanket by an open window somewhere in the English countryside. I read every single one, truly. It means so much to me. All right, love, let's begin. Nobody rings for her maid at 7 in the morning. That is the first thing to understand about the woman we're about to meet. In the version of this story you have seen in films, she wakes in a shaft of golden light. Bells are rung. A small army of servants descends. That is not how it happens. It is closer to 11, and the room is dim, heavy velvet curtains drawn tight against a Fifth Avenue morning she has no intention of witnessing, and the first sound is not a bell at all. It is the soft click of her own lighter, because before her feet touch the floor, before anyone has been summoned for anything, she wants a cigarette, and there is something faintly thrilling in that. Still, even now, even though half of New York does it, maybe she's a banker's daughter who married better than he expected. Maybe she is new money trying to sound like old money, or old money quietly appalled by all this new money crowding into her club. Maybe she is 26, or maybe she is 41 and simply refuses to discuss it. Whoever she is, she's lying in a bed that costs more than most families' houses, staring at a ceiling painted with a mural nobody really looks at anymore. And here is the strange, contradictory thing at the centre of her life. She has never in her adult existence poured her own bathwater, and she has also never once felt, in any real sense, that anything around her belonged only to her. That is the paradox we're going to sit inside tonight. Not judgment of it, just a long, close look. Let us actually meet her properly, though, because a person is more interesting than a category. Call her Cordelia for tonight, since we need a name, and she needs one too. Cordelia is not the richest woman in New York, and she is not the poorest of the rich, which is its own strange, specific kind of anxiety, being comfortably, invisibly, unspectacularly wealthy in a decade that worships spectacle. Her husband made his money in something dull and profitable, and she spends a good portion of her waking life making sure nobody remembers that it was dull. She has a lady's maid named Ruth, who has been with her for 6 years and knows more about her marriage than her own sister does, and she has, somewhere in a drawer she does not open often, a stack of unanswered letters from her mother, who still lives in Ohio, and still cannot quite believe how her daughter turned out. 2 minutes in, and already I want to slow down on something, because this is where I think most retellings of this era get it wrong. They rush straight to the flapper, the bob haircut, the beaded dress, the jazz. And we will get there, I promise. All of it. But first, something smaller. On Cordelia's nightstand next to the ashtray sits a compact of face powder that would have scandalized her own mother 15 years earlier, not because of what is in it, but because it exists on a nightstand at all, in plain view, unhidden. In 1890, a respectable woman did not let anyone see her apply rouge, did not admit to it, did not even keep the tools of the trade somewhere a guest might stumble upon them. By 1922, respectable women are reapplying lipstick at the dinner table, in front of God and their mothers-in-law, and everyone using a small mirror produced from a beaded handbag without so much as an apology. That single object on the nightstand is a small revolution, And Cordelia does not think about it that way at all. To her it is Tuesday. Here is weird thing number 1. It is not that she wears makeup, we do that too, obviously. It is that the specific look she wears, 2 distinct unblended circles of colour sitting high and visible on each cheekbone, was considered the height of sophistication in 1922, and would, by the beauty standards you and I grew up with, look almost theatrical, maybe even a little clownish, more suited to a stage than a dinner table. I find that detail genuinely fascinating, actually, the way an entire social earthquake can sit quietly on a bedside table, and nobody in the room notices the ground has moved. So here is topic number 1, properly, before we move anywhere else. The face. In this decade, the wealthy American woman's face changes more dramatically than it had in the previous 2 centuries combined. Powder becomes public, rouge becomes public, and most startling of all, a substance that had been associated almost exclusively with actresses and, to put it delicately, women of a certain unrespectable profession, becomes something duchesses and department store heiresses wear to the opera. That substance is dark, dramatic eye makeup, kohl and mascara, smudged deliberately around the eyes to create the wide, wounded, knowing look you have seen in every photograph of this era, without ever quite asking why it looks like that. Cordelia's mother would have called it paint, in the old damning sense of the word, the sense that meant a woman was advertising something she should be keeping to herself. Cordelia calls it Tuesday morning. Weird thing number 2. Try to imagine a doctor today writing you a prescription for a cocktail. That is roughly the scale of what is about to happen in this story, and Cordelia's own family will be the ones filling it. There is a wonderful, slightly absurd detail buried in the beauty rituals of the era that I want to give you, because it tells you everything about how quickly the old rules collapsed. Rouge, in the previous generation, when it was used at all, was applied in secret and blended so thoroughly that the entire point was for nobody to know it was there. The whole art form was invisibility. By the middle of this decade, wealthy women are painting 2 distinct visible circles of colour high on their cheekbones. On purpose, not blended away at all, a look borrowed directly from stage makeup because stage makeup has to read from the back row, and increasingly, so does a woman's face at a party where she needs to be seen, remembered, discussed. The goal is no longer invisibility. The goal is to be unmistakable from across a crowded room. And already we have moved from her nightstand to a philosophy of visibility without me announcing that we were going to talk about philosophy, which I think is exactly how these things should work. Ruth arrives round 11:15. Not because Cordelia rang for her, but because Ruth has learned the rhythm of this household better than Cordelia has learned it herself. And there is something worth noticing in that. A small, quiet fact that undercuts the whole fantasy of servants as background furniture. Ruth chooses which stockings survive another wearing and which get handed down. Ruth knows, before Cordelia does most mornings, whether last night went well or badly, because she can read it in the state of the beaded dress crumpled on the chaise, whether it was removed carefully or simply stepped out of and abandoned. We are not going to spend the next 20 minutes on the dressing ritual, though, because that particular scene has been done to death, and honestly, I think it flattens something more interesting. Let us step sideways instead, out of the bedroom entirely, because there is a sound coming from downstairs that deserves our attention. It is the telephone, and it will not stop ringing. Here is something people rarely think about when they picture Roaring Twenties wealth. The telephone, that black candlestick shape sitting in the front hall on its own little table, is both a status symbol and a genuine nuisance, and rich households have not yet worked out the etiquette around it. Cordelia's number is one of the newer, more coveted kinds, a private line rather than the party lines that most of the country still shares with 4 or 5 other households who can listen in if they choose to, and often do, out of pure boredom. Having your own line, with no one else able to pick up their receiver and hear your business, is in itself a small announcement of wealth, almost as loud as a fur coat. Down in the hall, the housekeeper, a stern, capable woman named Mrs. Halloran, who has run this house since before Cordelia moved in, answers on the 3rd ring, because answering too quickly looks eager, and that will never do. It is Cordelia's sister-in-law, calling about tonight, about whether the Whitfields are coming, about whether it is true what everyone is saying about the Whitfields. Mrs. Halloran carries the receiver up 2 flights of stairs on a long cord that snakes behind her like something alive. Because Cordelia has a telephone extension in her own sitting room now, a luxury so new that the wire had to be run through the wall by a man who came specifically for that purpose and charged accordingly. Stay with me a moment, because there is a detail here I genuinely love. The instructions given to servants at the time in the etiquette manuals actually printed for households like this one included specific guidance on how to announce a telephone call without appearing to have any curiosity whatsoever about its contents. A good servant hands over the receiver the way she might hand over a hot plate. Present, careful, entirely uninterested in what happens next, even though, of course, she is enormously interested. Everyone in that house is enormously interested. Gossip is the true currency of 1920s high society, more valuable in its way than the money itself. What nobody tells you about telephones in wealthy households of this decade is how much anxiety they generate rather than relieve. Before the telephone, an unwelcome visitor could at least be turned away at the door with a plausible excuse, not at home, indisposed, resting. The telephone offers no such shelter. It rings and rings in the hallway, insistent, impossible to ignore for long without the entire household wondering what on earth is going on. And a woman of Cordelia's position is expected to be available to it in a way she was never expected to be available to a caller at the front door. There is a particular kind of 1920s exhaustion that comes purely from the ringing of telephones, and you will not find that mentioned in a single history textbook, because it sounds too small to matter. It mattered enormously to the people living inside it. Now, here is where the sister-in-law's real news comes in, and it is worth pausing on because it tells you something about how information itself moved through this world. It is true apparently about the Whitfields. Mr. Whitfield's warehouse on the west side, the one everyone assumed contained textiles, was raided 2 nights ago, and what the federal agents found inside were not bolts of fabric at all but crates upon crates of Canadian whiskey, stacked floor to ceiling, enough to keep half of Manhattan's dinner parties supplied through the winter. Nobody in Cordelia's circle is particularly shocked by this. What shocks them, if anything shocks them at all anymore, is that the Whitfields got caught, because getting caught suggests a kind of carelessness that reflects poorly on everyone who has been quietly buying from the same supply chain for years, which brings us, gently, into topic number 2. And I want to be honest with you, this is one of my favourite contradictions of the entire decade. Prohibition, the law of the land, passed with enormous moral fanfare, enforced with wildly uneven enthusiasm, and almost entirely, cheerfully, unapologetically ignored by the very class of Americans who could most easily afford to obey it. Let us slow down here, because the popular image of prohibition, the back-alley speakeasy with its trapdoor and its coded knock, tells only half the story, and honestly the less interesting half if you are curious about how the wealthy actually lived. A truly rich household in 1923 did not need a speakeasy at all. It needed a wine cellar, stocked before the law took effect by men who saw it coming and bought in bulk, sometimes literally emptying entire shipments off the docks in the final legal weeks before the amendment took hold. Cordelia's own husband has a locked room behind the pantry that the household staff refer to only as the study, never by its actual contents, an unspoken agreement that protects everyone, servant and master alike, from having to say the word illegal out loud inside their own home. And here is a detail I find almost unbearably funny, in a dry sort of way. Doctors, real, licensed physicians, were permitted under the law to prescribe whiskey for medicinal purposes, and wealthy families kept their family doctors remarkably busy writing these prescriptions for ailments that bore a striking, suspicious resemblance to simple thirst, a case of nerves, a weakness of the constitution, a delicate stomach requiring fortification. Cordelia's own mother-in-law, a woman who has never in her life admitted to enjoying a drink, keeps a standing prescription renewed every month, filled at a pharmacy 2 blocks from her apartment, for medicinal purposes only, of course. Weird thing number 3. A licensed doctor writing a legal prescription for whiskey so a respectable woman could drink it without technically breaking the law she publicly claimed to support. The hypocrisy of it does not seem to trouble anyone in this particular social stratum, and that itself is the point worth sitting with. Prohibition, as actually lived by the wealthy, was never really about abstaining. It was about the appearance of order layered over a private world where the old rules simply did not apply, where a locked door and a discreet staff and enough money to make a problem disappear meant the law became something that happened to other people, poorer people, people without a study behind the pantry. Of course, that is not the whole story of what changed in these years. Something happened to the female body itself, or rather, to what wealthy women were suddenly permitted, even encouraged to do with it, and it happened faster than almost any other shift in the history of fashion. For generations before Cordelia was born, a woman's shape was something built, engineered really, through whalebone and steel boning and layers of fabric cinched tight enough to leave marks on the skin that lasted long after the corset came off each night. Her own mother wore one every single day of her adult life, without exception, the way she brushed her teeth or said her prayers, an object so fundamental to being a respectable woman that going without one was not merely unfashionable, it bordered on indecent, a sign that a woman had let herself go in some deep, faintly moral sense. By the time Cordelia is dressing for lunch this particular afternoon, the corset has all but vanished from her wardrobe, and what has replaced it is almost stranger in its own way than what came before. The fashionable silhouette of this decade wants no curves at all. It wants a flat chest, narrow hips, the long straight line of a boy's body dressed in silk. Women who were naturally curved, and there were plenty of them, found themselves binding their own chests flat with strips of fabric, wrapping and compressing in the opposite direction from their mothers, achieving through different means the same basic fact, a body reshaped to fit a fashion rather than a fashion built to fit a body. Weird thing number 4. A woman wrapping her own chest tightly in fabric every single morning, simply to look fashionable at lunch, is not something you would see today, and yet in 1923, it was as ordinary a part of getting dressed as choosing which stockings to wear. I want to sit with that for a second, because I think it is genuinely one of the strangest reversals in the history of clothing. The old corset promised an hourglass, exaggerated curves, a waist a man could supposedly span with his 2 hands. The new undergarment, sometimes literally called a flattener, promised the opposite, the erasure of every curve a woman's body might naturally possess. 2 entirely different ideals, separated by barely a decade, and both of them in their own way, telling a woman that her actual body was somehow the wrong starting point. Ruth understands this new geometry as well as she understood the old one, and there is something almost tender in watching her work, wrapping the long strip of fabric around Cordelia's chest with practiced, efficient hands, tucking the end in flat so it will not show a ridge under the thin silk of the afternoon dress. Neither of them discusses whether this is more or less comfortable than what came before. It simply is what a fashionable woman wears now, and comfort, as ever, is a secondary consideration to appearance. Here is the detail that stops people cold every time I mention it, though. Beneath all the glamour, beneath the beaded fringe and the dropped waist and the shockingly bare knees, the actual undergarments of a 1920s society woman were often simpler, lighter, and genuinely less restrictive than anything her mother had worn, even accounting for the binding. A single silk step-in slip could replace what used to require 4 or 5 separate layers: corset cover, corset, petticoat, chemise. In a strange way, for all the new pressures this decade placed on a woman's appearance, her actual physical freedom of movement, her ability to bend, to sit, to breathe without a rib literally being held in place by steel, expanded enormously. She could raise her arms over her head without assistance. She could, for the first time in the memory of anyone living, run. And that leads us somewhere I did not expect to go quite yet. But here we are, because Cordelia is not spending this particular afternoon at lunch after all. She is going driving. Her husband bought her the car 8 months ago, a sleek dark blue roadster with cream-coloured wheels, ostensibly as an anniversary gift, though Cordelia suspects it was at least partly meant to keep her occupied and out of his particular corner of Manhattan during the hours he prefers to spend elsewhere. She does not mind the arrangement nearly as much as she probably should. Learning to drive it herself, rather than simply being driven, was its own small act of rebellion, one her own mother found genuinely alarming when she heard about it over the telephone, her voice tight with a worry that had nothing to do with traffic accidents and everything to do with what the neighbors would say about a married woman navigating the city alone, without a chauffeur, without a chaperone, without a single man present to explain where she was going or why. A decade earlier, this simply would not have happened, not in Cordelia's social circle. A lady did not drive herself anywhere of consequence. She was driven, seated properly in the back, a driver up front handling the actual mechanics of the thing, while she remained, as ever, decorative and passive. Now Cordelia sits behind the wheel herself, in a snug little hat, pinned tightly enough to survive the open air, gloved hands gripping leather, and there is something in the particular thrill of it, the engine's low growl beneath her, the wind pulling strands loose from beneath her hat, despite every pin, that she has never quite been able to explain to her mother, or frankly to anyone. I think what she is actually describing, without having the words for it exactly, is the sensation of being unsupervised in public for the first time in her adult life. That is worth noticing. It should not have taken an automobile to give a grown woman that particular freedom, but it did, and here we are. The car itself smells of leather and gasoline and, faintly, of her own perfume, which has settled somehow into the upholstery after months of driving. It is a smell she associates now with a very specific feeling, a kind of held breath right before something happens, and she gets that feeling most strongly not on the wide, respectable avenues where everyone can see her, but on the smaller streets downtown, closer to the theaters, closer to the places she is technically not supposed to know exist. Which brings us naturally to where she is actually driving tonight, though it is not tonight yet. Not quite. The afternoon still has hours left in it. But let me tell you where this particular thread leads, because it explains something essential about how this whole social world operated after dark. Dancing, in this decade, becomes something close to scandalous, and not for the reasons you might assume. It is not the alcohol, though of course there is alcohol. It is the proximity. For the entire span of Cordelia's mother's adult life, ballroom dancing kept a careful, measured distance between partners, a formal geometry of space that a chaperone could observe from across the room without any discomfort at all. The dances sweeping through wealthy ballrooms and private clubs now, the ones with names like the Charleston and the Foxtrot, close that distance considerably, bodies pressed near enough that older observers, women exactly like Cordelia's mother, wrote letters to newspapers describing the new dancing as, in their words, an offense against decency performed in plain sight of God and everybody, and yet the very people writing those letters often had daughters or granddaughters dancing exactly those dances in exactly those clubs, sometimes on the very same nights the letters were being composed. That gap between the moral language of the older generation and the actual behavior of the younger one living under the same roof is one of the defining tensions of this entire decade, and we are going to keep circling back to it tonight because it shows up again and again in a dozen different forms. Alright, let us leave Cordelia in her roadster for now, the afternoon light catching the cream-coloured wheels, and let the pace of this story slow down properly, the way these evenings always do once the sun starts to lower. By 7 in the evening, the roadster is back in its garage and Cordelia is somewhere else entirely, standing in front of her wardrobe with Ruth beside her, the two of them deciding what version of herself tonight requires. There is a dinner first, a proper one, at the home of people whose name matters more than their actual company, and then, quietly, unofficially, something else afterward. Something that will not appear on any invitation, because invitations are not how you learn about it. You learn about it the way everyone in this world learns about anything worth knowing, through a friend of a friend, a name dropped at the end of a telephone call, an address memorized rather than written down. I want to spend some real time on the dinner itself before we get anywhere near the parts of the evening people usually find more thrilling, because I think the dinner tells you more about how this world actually functioned than the parties ever do. The dining room where Cordelia arrives just before 8 is lit almost entirely by candlelight, not because electricity is unavailable, the house has it throughout, but because candlelight is considered more flattering, more intimate, and frankly more expensive looking, a small performance of taste that costs more in servants' labour, trimming wicks and replacing candles through a 4-hour meal, than electric bulbs ever would. The table itself seats 18, set with a precision that took 2 servants the better part of the afternoon. Each fork angled exactly so, each crystal glass positioned at a distance from the plate measured almost to the inch, because a place setting slightly askew is the kind of thing certain guests would notice and, worse, remember. Here is something that might surprise you about wealthy dinner parties of this decade. Something I did not fully appreciate until I started reading the etiquette manuals actually printed for households like this one. The meal itself, the food, is almost beside the point. What matters is the choreography around it, who is seated beside whom, in what order the courses arrive, how long a polite silence is permitted to stretch before someone is expected to fill it. A hostess like the one Cordelia is dining with tonight will have spent the better part of a week deciding seating arrangements alone, because seating a person too far from the head of the table is a message, and seating them too close to someone they have quarreled with is a catastrophe, and everyone at that table understands the language being spoken even though not a single word of it is ever said aloud. There is a particular moment partway through the meal that I find myself thinking about more than almost anything else from this era, and it involves something as small as a fork. A guest, a young man newly arrived in this social circle through marriage rather than birth, reaches for the wrong utensil, the fish fork instead of the one meant for the course actually in front of him. Nobody says anything. Nobody needs to. 3 women at that table notice, exchange the smallest possible glance, and by the following week the story of his mistake will have travelled to at least a dozen other dinner tables across the city, told and retold, each time with slightly more emphasis on how obviously he did not belong. That is the actual mechanism of this society. Not cruelty exactly, though it certainly functions like cruelty if you are on the receiving end of it, but a system of small, silent tests that separate the people who were born knowing the rules from the people who had to learn them, and it never, ever stops running, not for a single meal, not for a single moment. Cordelia knows the rules the way she knows her own name, has known them since before she could read, and there is a particular kind of exhaustion in that too, one she rarely lets herself examine too closely. Being fluent in a language you never chose to learn is its own quiet burden, even when fluency in it is precisely what keeps you safe. Now, let us slow down here for a moment, because I want to tell you about what happens after dinner, and it is not what you might expect. The women withdraw first, as they always do, leaving the men behind with cigars and brandy and whatever conversation men of that era believed women should not be present for, though of course the women know perfectly well what is being discussed. Business mostly, money, the same subjects that will be discussed again once everyone reconvenes, only now performed as though it were a mystery kept from half the room. In the drawing room, away from the men, something looser happens. Cigarette cases come out, gold and silver ones, engraved with initials, and here is a detail that always catches people off guard when I mention it. Smoking, for a woman of Cordelia's social standing, in a room full of other women exactly like her, is no longer remotely shocking. It has become, in fact, almost fashionable to smoke elegantly, to hold a cigarette in a long ivory holder rather than between bare fingers, to exhale slowly toward the ceiling, in a way that has clearly been practiced in a mirror more than once. 15 years earlier, a respectable woman caught smoking in public could have been genuinely ruined by it. Socially speaking, the word for what she was risking being reputation, spoken then with a weight it has since lost almost entirely. Now, in this drawing room, not smoking would be the thing that drew attention, the thing that marked a woman as somehow behind the times, unfashionably innocent, faintly ridiculous. And yet, and here is the contradiction again, the one we keep circling back to tonight, several of these same women, Cordelia included, would never dream of smoking in front of their own mothers, would tuck the cigarette case away entirely the moment an older relative entered the room, performing an innocence they have already, quite thoroughly, outgrown. It is not hypocrisy exactly, or not only hypocrisy. It is something closer to a private negotiation each of them makes daily between the world they were raised to belong to and the one they actually live in now. 2 worlds occupying the same rooms, the same women, sometimes within the space of a single evening. There is another quiet negotiation happening at that dinner table, one that rarely makes it into the glamorous retellings of this decade, and it concerns food itself, or rather, how little of it these women were actually eating. The fashionable silhouette we talked about earlier, that flat, narrow, boyish line, did not arrive without cost, and the cost was frequently paid at the dinner table, in the form of a woman pushing food around her plate with practiced invisible skill, appearing to participate in a four-course meal while actually consuming almost none of it. Cordelia has become quite good at this particular performance over the years, cutting her food into small, deliberate pieces, engaging in conversation at exactly the moments a mouthful might otherwise be expected, letting a course be cleared away 3/4 full without anyone at the table remarking on it, because remarking on another woman's eating, or lack of it, simply is not done. Magazines of this era, the ones Cordelia and her friends pass between themselves, openly advise women on how to achieve and maintain a slender figure, sometimes through what we would now recognize as deeply troubling methods. Cigarettes recommended explicitly as an appetite suppressant, entire days of eating reduced to grapefruit and black coffee, a kind of quiet, sanctioned deprivation dressed up as fashion advice. I want to be careful here, because I do not want to linger on this in a way that turns it into something instructive rather than simply true. It is simply true. The thinness so celebrated in the photographs and illustrations of this decade very often required a level of hunger that nobody at the time was particularly interested in discussing honestly. There is something almost eerie about how normalized it all became, tucked in between advertisements for face powder and the latest hemlines, presented with the same breezy, confident tone as advice about which shade of stocking best matched an evening gown. Cordelia read those magazines as a teenager, the way an entire generation of wealthy young women did, and she does not remember a single moment when anyone suggested there was anything strange about learning to be hungry as a matter of fashion. It simply was the water everyone swam in. I find myself wanting to sit with that for longer than feels comfortable, honestly, before we move on, because it is the kind of detail that gets glossed over in favor of the beaded dresses and the champagne, and I think it deserves better than that. Let us move somewhere lighter for a moment, though, because the evening is not over and there is a card table waiting in the next room. Bridge, the card game, has become something close to a religion among women of Cordelia's set, played with an intensity that would surprise anyone who thinks of it as a quaint, gentle pastime. Money changes hands at these tables, sometimes significant amounts of it, and a woman's reputation as a bridge partner, sharp, reliable, capable of reading her partner's signals without a word spoken, matters in ways that ripple outward into other parts of her social standing entirely. Cordelia's mother-in-law, the same woman with the standing whiskey prescription, is famous within this circle for a memory so precise she can recall the exact sequence of cards played in a hand from 3 years earlier, and there is a kind of grudging respect paid to that skill that is paid to almost nothing else a woman in this world is permitted to excel at publicly. Alongside the bridge, quietly, almost superstitiously, something else has taken hold among these women, something that would have struck their grandmothers as faintly ridiculous and their great-grandmothers as genuinely alarming. Spiritualism, the practice of contacting the dead, has become a fashionable, if slightly whispered about pastime in exactly these drawing rooms. The losses of the war are still recent enough, still close enough to the surface, that more than one woman at tonight's dinner has a brother or a husband or a son she would very much like to speak with one more time. And there are mediums in this city, some of them genuinely believed, others quietly understood to be entertainment dressed up as the genuine article, who make a comfortable living arranging exactly that kind of conversation for women who can afford the sitting fee. Cordelia herself attended a séance 8 months ago, at the invitation of a friend who swore by the woman conducting it, and she still is not entirely sure what she believes about what happened in that dim, candlelit room. The table trembling faintly under everyone's fingertips, a voice that was not quite the medium's own voice, suggesting things about her late father that felt, in the moment, impossible to have been guessed. She has not gone back since. She has also not entirely dismissed it either, and she keeps that particular uncertainty tucked away, unmentioned, in roughly the same private drawer as her mother's unanswered letters. By 11, the dinner has properly ended, the older guests already retreating to their cars and their beds, and something shifts in the room the moment they leave, a kind of exhale passing among the ones who remain. This is the part of the evening Cordelia actually came for. if she is honest with herself, though she would never phrase it quite that plainly to her mother. 4 of them pile into a car together. Not Cordelia's roadster this time, but a friend's larger sedan, better suited to the particular discretion the next stop requires, and they drive south, away from the wide, well-lit avenues, into streets that grow narrower and less certain of themselves the further they go. There is no sign outside the building they finally stop in front of. There is in fact nothing about the building at all to suggest it contains anything other than a shuttered dry goods shop, which is rather the entire point. One of Cordelia's friends knocks a specific pattern against a side door, low and unremarkable, and after a pause just long enough to feel deliberate, a small panel slides open at eye level, a single eye assessing them for a moment before the door itself opens. I want to describe what is behind that door carefully, because the popular image, the glittering chandeliered speakeasy of the movies, is not quite accurate, or rather, it is accurate for only a small handful of the most famous establishments. Most of them, including this one, are considerably plainer than that, a converted basement or storeroom, tables crowded close together, the air already thick with cigarette smoke, and the particular smell of gin that has not been aged nearly as long as the label on the bottle claims. What makes the room feel glamorous is not the decor at all, it is the people in it, the dresses, the jewellery, the particular electric quality of being somewhere that, technically, none of them are supposed to be. The band tonight is genuinely extraordinary, and this is worth pausing on, because it represents one of the strange, complicated truths of this decade that does not fit neatly into either a celebration or a condemnation of it. The musicians playing for Cordelia and her friends tonight are black men from Harlem, extraordinarily talented, playing a kind of music that barely existed as a formal genre a decade earlier, and the wealthy white patrons of this club, Cordelia very much included, consider themselves sophisticated, even daring, for appreciating it. And yet those same patrons would not, in almost any circumstance, have invited these musicians to sit at their dinner tables, would not have considered them guests in any social sense at all, even as they paid to be entertained by them nightly, and spoke of jazz as though discovering it had been their own act of cultural bravery. That contradiction sat, mostly unexamined, at the centre of this entire scene, and I think it is important to say so plainly, rather than let the glamour of the music carry the whole story on its own. The Roaring Twenties gave enormous cultural power and visibility to black musicians and performers, genuinely reshaping American music forever in ways still felt today, and it did so within a social structure that remained, in almost every other respect, rigidly and cruelly unequal. Both things are true at once. Neither one cancels the other out. Cordelia, for her part, is thinking about none of this tonight. She is thinking about the trumpet, the way it seems to bend notes that should not be able to bend, and about the gin fizz sweating in her hand, and about the particular lightness that comes from being somewhere her mother would be horrified to picture her, somewhere with no place cards, no seating chart, no fork that could be mistakenly reached for and quietly, permanently held against her. The dancing here is nothing like the careful, measured steps of her wedding, 6 years earlier now, a lifetime ago it sometimes feels. This is close and loud and slightly reckless, bodies moving in ways that would have gotten a woman quietly escorted out of any respectable ballroom a decade before. Her friend Josephine, 3 drinks deep and laughing at something Cordelia did not quite catch, kicks off her shoes entirely at one point, dancing barefoot on a floor that is almost certainly not clean, and nobody in their party thinks twice about it. There is a particular kind of freedom in that basement room that none of them will ever quite be able to explain properly to anyone who was not there. A freedom built entirely on this. For these few hours, the rules that governed every other room they occupied simply do not apply, or apply so loosely as to be almost decorative. It will not last past sunrise. By tomorrow afternoon, Cordelia will be back at another dinner table, another seating chart, another fork chosen correctly out of long habit. But tonight, for now, there is gin and brass, and a floor that does not care whose grandfather did what. Let me take you somewhere different now, because Cordelia's world, for all its particular details, is only one version of wealth in this decade, and there is another one worth understanding. A season rather than a single evening, a ritual so elaborate it consumed entire years of a young woman's life before she had any real say in the matter. I am talking about the debutante season, and specifically about a young woman named Frances, who everyone who matters calls Frankie, though never, ever in front of her grandmother. Frankie is 18 this year, and this year, whether she particularly wants it or not, is the year she comes out. A phrase that means something quite specific and quite formal in this world, nothing at all like its more modern meaning. Coming out means a presentation, a debut, a young woman's formal introduction to society as an eligible, marriageable adult, marked by a ball so expensive it could fund a small hospital, thrown in her honor by parents who have been planning it, in some sense, since the week she was born. Here is something that surprises people when I mention it, something that cuts against the popular image of the flapper as a symbol of total female liberation in this decade. Underneath all the bobbed hair and the daring dances, the actual machinery of upper-class marriage in the 1920s remained, in most respects, almost exactly as calculated and transactional as it had been for their grandmothers. Frankie's debut is not, whatever anyone says out loud, primarily about celebrating her. It is a market, dressed beautifully, lit by chandeliers, and she is in the plainest possible terms, the product being introduced. The dress alone took 11 fittings, white silk, beaded from neckline to hem, in a pattern that took a team of seamstresses the better part of 2 months, and Frankie remembers standing very still through each fitting while pins were adjusted around her, thinking mostly about how badly her feet already ached in the shoes she would be wearing for perhaps 6 hours straight on the night itself, dancing with a receiving line of young men whose family names her mother had already, quietly, ranked in order of preference. Every name on the guest list for a debut like Frankie's has been chosen with a purpose, and the list itself runs into the hundreds, and every single name on it has been chosen with a precision that has nothing to do with genuine friendship, and almost everything to do with strategy. Which families need to be flattered, which sons are of an appropriate age, and standing to be worth introducing to Frankie specifically, which older women, the true gatekeepers of this entire system, need to witness Frankie handling herself well enough to report back favorably to their own social circles. Frankie's mother has spent more hours on that guest list than she spent, by her own admission, choosing the wallpaper for the entire house. There is a particular moment on the night of the ball itself that Frankie will describe, years later, as the strangest of her entire life, and it happens right at the start, when she is announced. A man at the top of the staircase, a professional whose entire job consists of correctly pronouncing names and titles at events exactly like this one, calls out her full name to a ballroom of perhaps 400 people, and for one suspended moment, every single face in that enormous room turns upward to look at her, all at once, and she understands, with total clarity, standing there at the top of the stairs in her 11 times fitted dress, that she is being assessed, evaluated, priced, in a way that has almost nothing to do with who she actually is as a person, and everything to do with what she represents. I do not think Frankie would use the word trapped, not out loud, not even privately in most of her waking thoughts. She loves the dress. She loves, if she is honest, the attention, at least in the moment, the particular thrill of being the center of 400 people's focus, even if she cannot fully control what they are focusing on. But there is something underneath the excitement too, something quieter, that she does not have quite the vocabulary yet to name, a sense that this entire elaborate, beautiful evening is less a celebration of her arrival into adulthood and more the opening move in a negotiation she did not get to choose the terms of. Her grandmother, watching from a chair near the edge of the dance floor, remembers her own debut nearly 40 years earlier and remarks to a friend beside her, with what she clearly intends as approval, that girls today have it so much easier than her own generation did. Frankie, catching the tail end of that comment as she passes by on the arm of a young man whose family fortune her mother has already privately deemed acceptable, is not entirely sure her grandmother is wrong. The rules have changed enormously on the surface, the hemlines, the dancing, the freedom to smoke and drive and stay out past midnight, but underneath all of that surface change, the actual machinery deciding who Frankie is permitted to marry, and therefore who she is permitted to become, has moved remarkably little. Summer changes everything for families like Frankie's, and I want to take you there next, because the season shifts the entire geography of wealth in this decade in a way that is easy to forget now. Once the heat of the city becomes genuinely unbearable, sometime in late June, the entire upper crust of New York society more or less relocates en masse to a handful of very specific places, Newport most famously, though Long Island's North Shore is quickly becoming its rival, dotted increasingly with what everyone has started calling, half admiringly and half mockingly, the mansions of new money. Frankie's family keeps a house in Newport that her grandfather built, a house so large that entire wings of it go essentially unused for months at a time, staffed nonetheless year-round by servants whose entire job for the empty months is simply keeping it ready for a family that is not there. I find something almost melancholy in that fact, honestly, if you sit with it long enough. A house built specifically to be seen, to be occupied by crowds of guests during 8 or 9 particular weeks each summer, standing otherwise nearly silent for the rest of the year, dusted, polished, heated in winter, cooled in summer, entirely for the sake of appearances that only a handful of people will ever actually witness in person. The Newport houses of this era were not really called houses at all by the families who owned them. They were called cottages, a word chosen with what I can only describe as a truly spectacular amount of irony, since some of these cottages contained upward of 70 rooms, and required a domestic staff numbering in the dozens simply to remain functional. Frankie's family's cottage, comparatively modest by Newport standards, still employs a full-time staff of 11 during the summer season, a number that swells considerably when a large party is being hosted. Let me tell you about the world below stairs in a house like this one, because it is every bit as structured, every bit as hierarchical as the world above it, just in a different key entirely. The butler sits at the top of that particular hierarchy, a man named Whitcomb in Frankie's household, who has served this family for over 20 years and who commands a level of quiet authority among the other staff that would surprise anyone who thinks of servants as an undifferentiated mass. Below him sits the housekeeper, who governs the female staff with an equally firm hand, and below her, in careful unspoken order, the ladies' maids, the footmen, the kitchen staff, the gardeners, the chauffeurs, each group aware of precisely where they stand relative to the others, each group with its own version of the same social anxieties that govern the family upstairs. There is a particular rhythm to how this household actually runs that most of the family upstairs never fully sees or understands, and I think that is worth sitting with for a moment, because it undercuts a certain fantasy about wealth in this era, the fantasy that the family is somehow the true center of gravity in their own home. The servants know things about that family that the family members do not know about each other. They know which guest rooms need to be prepared quietly, without questions asked, for arrivals that will not appear on any official guest list. They know, from the state of a bed in the morning, whether a marriage is currently a comfortable one or a strained one. They know, long before any announcement is made, when a family fortune has taken a hit, because the instructions from the housekeeper about household spending shift subtly, a slightly cheaper cut of meat ordered, a slightly longer interval between replacing linens, changes so small that only someone paying very close attention would notice them at all. Whitcomb has seen 3 generations of this family pass through his care, has buried one of them personally in the sense that he was the one who managed every practical detail of the funeral while the family grieved, and there is a peculiar intimacy in that relationship, closer in some ways than many blood relationships, and yet utterly, permanently unequal. He will never sit at that dining table. He will never be invited to a single one of the parties he spends weeks preparing for. He knows this family's secrets more thoroughly than almost anyone alive, and he will take every single one of them to his own grave, because that particular silence is, in its own way, the actual service he is being paid for, more than the silver polishing or the wine selection ever was. I do not say any of this to diminish the genuine warmth that sometimes existed in these relationships, because it did exist, real affection, real loyalty, built up over decades in some cases. But I think it is worth being honest about the shape of that affection, bounded always by a line that was never, under any circumstances, permitted to be crossed in either direction. The mornings in Newport belong to sport, or at least to what passes for sport among people who have never once in their lives needed to move their bodies for any practical purpose. Frankie plays tennis most mornings on the private court behind the cottage, in an outfit that would have been unimaginable to her grandmother, a pleated white skirt that stops well above the ankle, sleeves that leave the forearms bare to the sun, an ensemble that prioritizes actual movement over modesty in a way that represents its own small, sweaty revolution. And here is a detail I genuinely love, because it flips an entire beauty standard on its head within the span of about 10 years. For centuries, pale skin signified wealth, precisely because it signified a life spent indoors, untouched by the sun, the opposite of a labourer's tanned, weathered hands and face. Frankie's grandmother went to extraordinary lengths her entire life to avoid the sun entirely, wide-brimmed hats, parasols, gloves even in summer heat, because a tan marked a woman as someone who worked outdoors, someone who could not afford the luxury of shade. By the time Frankie is playing tennis on that private court, the entire equation has flipped. A tan now signifies leisure rather than labour, because only the genuinely wealthy have the free time to lounge poolside or on a private beach long enough to acquire one, while the working poor remain pale from hours spent indoors in factories and shops. Frankie's mother, who spent her own youth avoiding the sun as diligently as her mother did, now actively seeks it out, reclining on the lawn in the afternoons with her face tilted upward, chasing a golden colour that would have mortified her own mother a generation earlier. The exact same physical trait, sun-darkened skin, flips from a mark of shame to a mark of status in the space of roughly one generation, and nobody involved seems to find that particularly strange, though of course it is strange, deeply strange, when you actually stop and look at it. There is a swimming component to all of this too, and it comes with its own small scandal attached. The bathing costumes now considered acceptable for a young woman like Frankie to wear at the private beach club would have gotten her mother arrested, quite literally, a decade or two earlier, under indecency laws that once measured, with a tape, exactly how many inches of leg a woman's swimming costume was permitted to reveal. Frankie's own costume this summer is a snug wool affair that stops mid-thigh, sleeveless, cut close to the body in a way designed for actual swimming rather than merely wading decoratively at the water's edge while fully dressed, which is essentially all her grandmother's generation was ever expected to do at the seaside. The afternoons shift towards something quieter, garden parties mostly, an endless rotation of them across the various cottages of Newport, each hostess competing, subtly but unmistakably, to outdo the others. There is a particular garden party later this same summer, hosted by a family whose fortune came from steel, that Frankie will remember for years afterward, mostly because of the ice sculpture, an enormous swan carved to stand at the center of the buffet table, melting steadily throughout the afternoon under the summer sun, requiring a servant stationed nearby, whose entire job for 4 hours is simply to monitor its condition and signal when it needs to be replaced before it collapses into an undignified puddle in front of 200 guests. I think about that ice swan more than I probably should, honestly. An object built entirely to be beautiful for a few hours and then discarded, requiring a human being's full attention simply to manage its slow, inevitable dissolution. There is something almost too perfect about it as a symbol for the wider culture surrounding it, though I do not think anyone at that garden party intended it that way. It was simply an ice sculpture, it simply looked lovely on the buffet table, and it simply eventually melted, the way everything at these parties, the fortunes, the marriages, the reputations, built so carefully across a single summer season, would eventually, in one way or another, melt too. Let me tell you about a wedding now, because a wedding in this world was never really about two people at all, whatever the ceremony itself might have suggested, and I think the contrast with everything we have already discussed tonight is worth drawing out carefully. The wedding I want to describe belongs to a young woman named Evangeline, a friend of Frankie's from 2 debutante seasons earlier, and it takes place at the end of that same summer, in a church so thick with white lilies that guests later joked, not entirely as a joke, about the smell lingering in their clothing for days afterward. Evangeline's dress alone cost more than most American families earned in 3 full years combined, a fact that nobody at the wedding found remotely troubling to mention out loud, over champagne, as though it was simply an interesting piece of trivia rather than an obscene disparity worth sitting with even briefly. 600 names filled the guest list, and the reception afterward, held on the grounds of the groom's family estate, featured an orchestra brought in specifically from the city, a raw bar flown in on ice from the coast, and a wedding cake standing nearly 6 feet tall, 7 tiers of it, each layer a different flavor chosen to please a different faction of the assembled families. It took 4 men to carry it in. Here is the part of Evangeline's story that I think matters more than the lilies or the cake, though. The marriage itself, the actual union being celebrated with such extraordinary expense, had been substantially negotiated, in the plainest sense of that word, between the two families' lawyers months before Evangeline and her intended groom had spent any meaningful private time together at all. There was a document, formal and binding, outlining exactly what would happen to whose money under exactly which future circumstances, and Evangeline's own father reviewed it more thoroughly, by his own later admission, than he reviewed almost anything else in his professional life, including several of his actual business contracts. Evangeline liked her husband well enough. She would say so honestly for the rest of her life, and there is no particular reason to doubt her. But liking, in this world, was always understood to be a fortunate bonus rather than the actual foundation the marriage was built on. The foundation was the document, the estates, the shared understanding between two families about what their combined fortunes and combined social standing could accomplish together that neither could quite accomplish alone. Love, if it arrived at all, arrived as a kind of grace note layered on top of an arrangement that would have proceeded regardless of whether it showed up or not. I do not think this makes Evangeline's wedding day any less genuinely joyful for her, and I do not want to flatten it into pure cynicism, because that would not be honest either. She cried real tears walking down that aisle. She meant the vows she spoke, as far as anyone can ever truly mean vows, spoken in front of 600 witnesses. But underneath the joy, quietly, permanently, sat the plain fact that this day had been engineered by people other than herself, for reasons that had very little to do with what she personally wanted, and a great deal to do with what her family's balance sheet required. Which brings me, naturally, to something considerably less celebrated, something that happened with startling frequency among exactly this same social class, and that is divorce, specifically the very particular, very deliberate ritual known at the time as the Reno divorce. By this point in the decade, divorce laws vary enormously from state to state, and a handful of wealthy, unhappy wives figured out, quite early on, that Nevada offered something no other state did, a residency requirement short enough, just 6 weeks, to be genuinely achievable, paired with grounds for divorce, loose enough to cover almost any marital complaint a lawyer could plausibly phrase. What developed out of that legal quirk was an entire, quietly thriving industry built around unhappy, wealthy women, temporarily relocating to Reno, checking into one of several hotels and guest ranches that catered specifically to this exact clientele, and waiting out their 6 weeks in a kind of strange, suspended limbo before returning home, legally single, to rebuild whatever came next. Cordelia knows a woman who did exactly this, 2 years back now, a friend of a friend named Beatrice, whose husband had, in the polite phrasing everyone used at the time, formed an attachment elsewhere, and Beatrice's 6 weeks in Reno became, in the retelling among Cordelia's circle, a strange kind of legend, part cautionary tale, part quiet inspiration. She stayed at a guest ranch alongside 4 other women in nearly identical circumstances, all of them from similar backgrounds, all of them waiting out the same clock, and by Beatrice's own later account, those 6 weeks, riding horses in the desert heat, eating meals with women who understood her situation without needing it explained, were among the freest of her entire adult life, a strange, unplanned gift tucked inside what was meant to be simply a legal formality. Not every woman who traveled to Reno found anything like freedom there, of course. For many it was simply humiliating, expensive and lonely, 6 weeks spent essentially in exile from the only life they had ever known, waiting for a judge to formally end a marriage that had already, in every meaningful sense, ended long before she boarded the train west. But the mere existence of the option, the simple truth that a woman of sufficient means could leave, wait, and return unmarried, represented something genuinely new, a crack in a system that had, for generations before this one, offered almost no dignified exit at all. Let me bring you back to Cordelia for a while now, because there is something in her jewelry box worth examining closely, and it tells its own quiet story about how wealth in this decade liked to announce itself. She keeps the box on her dressing table, a lacquered thing lined in dark blue velvet, and inside it sits a collection that would take a stranger's breath away, though Cordelia herself moves through it most mornings with the casual efficiency of someone selecting a hat rather than choosing among genuine fortunes. There are ropes of pearls, several of them, long enough to wrap 3 or 4 times around the throat and still hang well past the waist, worn now in the fashionable, almost careless style of the decade, knotted loosely, sometimes several strands mixed together rather than matched. A deliberate abandonment of the careful symmetry her mother's generation would have insisted on. Diamonds sit alongside the pearls, cut now in new geometric shapes that a jeweler a generation earlier would barely have recognized. Hard-edged and modern, set into headbands meant to be worn low across the forehead rather than perched formally atop the head the way a tiara once sat. This particular style, the diamond headband worn low over a shingled haircut, has become something close to a uniform among Cordelia's circle for evening events, and there is a specific reason for that uniform beyond mere fashion, one that connects directly back to something we touched on earlier tonight: the haircut itself. The short, sleek, close-cropped style everyone simply calls the bob represents its own small earthquake, and I do not think it gets nearly enough credit for how genuinely radical it was considered at the time. For the entirety of recorded history up to this exact decade, a woman's hair, long uncut, often left to grow her whole life, functioned as one of the most visible markers of femininity itself. Cutting it short, in the deliberate, severe style Cordelia and nearly every woman in her circle now wears, was not merely a fashion choice. It was widely understood, by supporters and critics alike, as a genuine political statement, a visible, undeniable rejection of an entire inherited idea about what a respectable woman was supposed to look like. Cordelia remembers the actual afternoon she had hers cut 4 years ago now, remembers sitting in the salon chair, watching what felt like enormous, irreversible lengths of her own hair fall to the floor around her, and remembers, more vividly than almost anything else from that day, the specific silence that fell over her own dinner table that same evening when her mother-in-law saw it for the first time. Nobody said a single word of open criticism. The silence itself was the criticism, stretched thin and cold across an entire meal, and Cordelia has never quite forgotten it, even 4 years and a great many shorter haircuts later. Her husband, for what it is worth, said he liked it. Cordelia has never been entirely certain whether she believed him. There is another object in that lacquered jewellery box worth mentioning, smaller than the pearls, easy to overlook entirely if you did not know to look for it, a slim gold cigarette case with her initials engraved on the front, a gift from her husband on an anniversary several years back. It sits there now beside diamonds worth considerably more, and yet Cordelia reaches for it almost as often as she reaches for any of the actual jewellery, because in its own small way, that cigarette case represents something the diamonds never quite managed to, a version of herself that exists slightly outside the careful performance the rest of her wardrobe requires. Let me pivot now to something else sitting in Cordelia's household, something considerably larger than a jewellery box, and something that arrived only within the last year, changing the rhythm of her evenings in ways she is still getting used to. The radio cabinet stands in the corner of the sitting room, an imposing piece of furniture nearly as tall as a small bookcase, its wood polished to match the rest of the room, and it represents, in Cordelia's household as in a great many wealthy households across the country this same year, an entirely new way of experiencing the wider world without ever leaving the sofa. Before this cabinet arrived, news travelled to Cordelia primarily through the newspaper, through telephone calls, through the slow human channels of gossip we discussed earlier tonight. Now, some evenings, she and her husband sit together in near silence, an experience almost unheard of in their marriage before this particular piece of furniture entered it, listening to a voice travelling invisibly through the air from a station downtown, delivering news or music, or once, memorably, a live broadcast of a prize fight that had both of them leaning forward in their chairs, genuinely gripped by an event happening in real time in a building neither of them had actually travelled to. There is something quietly strange about that experience that I do not think anyone fully articulated at the time, though people were certainly beginning to sense it. For the entire history of human communication, up until this exact moment, information travelled at the speed of a person, a letter, a telegram operator's fingers, a runner, a rider. Now in Cordelia's sitting room, a voice arrives instantaneously from miles away, and she and her husband sit together listening to it in a silence that has its own peculiar intimacy. Two people occupying the same room while their attention is entirely elsewhere, oriented outward together toward a voice neither of them can see. It is in its own quiet way a genuinely new kind of togetherness, one that did not exist in any previous generation of marriages, and nobody quite has the language yet to describe what it means. Cordelia's husband most nights is not actually listening to the prize fight or the music at all, not entirely. His mind, more often than either of them says out loud, is somewhere else, on numbers rising on a ticker tape downtown, because this decade has produced something else new and strange alongside the radio and the automobile and the bobbed hair. A genuinely widespread, almost fashionable obsession with the stock market, one that has crept well beyond the professional investors of a previous generation and into the conversation of ordinary dinner parties, garden parties even, occasionally drawing rooms full of women who a decade earlier would never have been expected to know or care what a stock actually was. Here is something that genuinely surprised me when I first read about it properly. By the middle of this decade, buying stocks on margin, essentially borrowing most of the purchase price against the promise of future gains, has become common enough that Cordelia herself holds a small account of her own, separate from her husband's considerably larger holdings, funded initially as something close to a joke, pin money her husband called it, meant for her own small indulgences. It has, over the past 18 months, more than tripled in value, and Cordelia has started, quietly, to take the whole enterprise a good deal more seriously than a joke. There is a particular quality to conversation at dinner parties this year that did not exist even 3 or 4 years earlier, a barely contained excitement running underneath even the most ordinary exchanges, because it seems, to nearly everyone in Cordelia's circle, as though the money genuinely never stops growing, as though the entire machine has found some permanent, effortless momentum that will simply continue indefinitely upward. Her husband's own father, considerably more cautious by temperament, has begun making quiet, unwelcome comments at family dinners about markets that rise too far too fast, comments that are received, generally, with the same polite, dismissive patience an older generation's warnings usually receive from a younger one, convinced it has found something genuinely new under the sun. I am not going to dwell on where that particular momentum eventually leads, because that is a different story for a different night, and tonight is not the night for it. I only mention it now because I think it belongs here, threaded quietly through the champagne and the ice swans and the diamond headbands, a low hum of unexamined confidence running beneath an entire decade's worth of extravagance, confidence that felt, to nearly everyone living inside it at the time, indistinguishable from simple permanent fact. Let me shift, gently, to something considerably less ominous, something that has also become newly fashionable in exactly this same social world, and that is talking, at great and often surprising length, about one's own unconscious mind. Psychoanalysis, the practice pioneered years earlier by a Viennese doctor whose name Cordelia's circle now drops into conversation with the easy familiarity of an old family friend, has arrived in American high society with a speed and enthusiasm that would likely have startled its own inventor. Wealthy New Yorkers, Cordelia among them, have begun visiting analysts with something close to the regularity their mothers once reserved for church, lying on a couch in a quiet, dim office once a week discussing dreams, childhood memories, half-remembered resentments toward parents, all of it framed now in an entirely new vocabulary, complexes and repressions and the unconscious mind, words that did not exist in any polite drawing-room conversation a decade earlier and now appear there with startling regularity, often deployed somewhat imprecisely by people who have absorbed the general shape of the ideas without necessarily understanding their finer points. Cordelia's own analyst is a small, precise man with a slight accent and an office on the east side, furnished with exactly one comfortable chair, which he occupies, and one narrow couch, which she occupies, and she has been seeing him now for the better part of a year, ostensibly for a persistent nervousness that troubles her sleep, though the sessions themselves have wandered, gradually and almost without her noticing, into territory considerably more personal than sleeplessness alone would explain. She has told this small, quiet man things she has never told her own husband, As described, in detail she still finds faintly embarrassing to recall afterward a recurring dream involving her father, dead now 6 years, standing at the far end of a hallway that never seems to get any shorter no matter how long she walks toward him. There is something genuinely new in this, something worth sitting with. For the first time in the memory of nearly anyone in Cordelia's circle, wealthy women are being offered, formally, through an actual paid professional relationship, a private space specifically designed for examining their own inner lives, separate entirely from the social performance that governs almost every other hour of their days. Whether the actual insights produced in that quiet East Side office are always sound is a different question entirely, one Cordelia herself does not spend much time interrogating. What matters to her, most weeks, is simply the hour itself, the narrow couch, the precise accented voice asking careful questions, the strange private luxury of being listened to without needing to perform anything at all in return. One particular institution I have not mentioned yet tonight deserves its own space because it functioned as something close to the true headquarters of wealthy social life across this entire decade, more so even than the private dinner tables we have already spent so much time inside. I mean the country club, and specifically the one Cordelia's family belongs to, a sprawling property just outside the city with a golf course, tennis courts, a pool, and a clubhouse dining room where a very particular kind of unofficial business gets conducted almost daily. Membership itself functions as a kind of quiet credential, one considerably harder to obtain than the dues alone would suggest. There is a waiting list, and there is a committee, and there is a process by which existing members vouch for prospective ones, a process that has, on more than one occasion within Cordelia's own memory, quietly and permanently excluded a family with more than enough money to afford the dues but insufficient, in the committee's private judgment, of whatever else membership was actually meant to signal. Nobody ever states this exclusion plainly. A family simply finds, after a certain point, that their application has not moved forward and eventually stops submitting it at all. Golf itself has become, over the course of this decade, considerably more than a pastime for the men in Cordelia's circle. It functions as a genuine extension of their professional lives, deals discussed and occasionally settled across 18 holes, with a casualness that would never be permitted in an actual office. Precisely because the golf course offers something an office cannot. Hours of unhurried proximity, long stretches of silence between shots during which two men can size each other up entirely outside the formal structures of a boardroom. Cordelia's husband has told her, more than once, that he learnt more about a man's actual character from a single round of golf than from a dozen formal business meetings, and she has come to believe there is real truth buried inside that claim, even if she finds the whole ritual, watched from the clubhouse veranda with a cold drink in hand, faintly absurd. Women play too, though the courses and the times allotted to them differ in ways that were simply understood rather than announced anywhere in writing. Certain hours belong, unofficially but unmistakably, to the men. Certain other hours, generally mid-morning on weekdays, belong to the women, and Cordelia has become a genuinely capable golfer over the past several years, good enough that she occasionally beats her own husband on the rare weekend afternoons when mixed play is permitted, an outcome he receives, to his credit, with reasonably good humour, though she has noticed he mentions it considerably less often at dinner than he mentions the times he wins. Health itself, or rather the elaborate performance of pursuing it, occupies an enormous amount of energy across this entire social world, and I want to spend a moment on it because it produced some of the strangest, most specifically 1920s artifacts of the whole decade. Patent medicines and tonics of every conceivable description crowd the shelves of Cordelia's own bathroom cabinet, promising everything from improved digestion to a more vibrant complexion to, in the case of one particularly popular tonic her mother-in-law swears by, an outright cure for what the label vaguely calls nervous exhaustion, a catch-all term that seems, on closer inspection, to cover nearly any complaint a wealthy woman of this era might present with. Electric belts, worn against the skin and promising to restore vitality through a mild, mysterious current, have their own quiet following among Cordelia's circle, alongside elaborate home exercise apparatus, pulleys and weighted bars mounted to bedroom walls, purchased with great enthusiasm and used, by Cordelia's own honest estimation, considerably less often than the initial enthusiasm would have predicted. There is a particular machine sitting unused in the corner of her own dressing room right now, a vibrating belt contraption promising to melt away unwanted inches through pure mechanical agitation, that she genuinely believed in for the better part of 2 months before quietly abandoning it in favor of simply eating less at dinner, which, whatever its own considerable problems, at least required no expensive equipment gathering dust. I find something genuinely touching, in a slightly rueful way, about the sheer creative energy this decade poured into inventing new ways for wealthy people to worry about their own bodies. Every single one of these tonics and belts and machines promised a shortcut, a modern, scientific-sounding solution to anxieties that were, underneath all the marketing language, exactly the same anxieties women had carried for generations, dressed up now in the vocabulary of electricity and mechanism, rather than the vocabulary of prayer or superstition their grandmothers might have used instead. There is a particular kind of danger running underneath all of this glamour that I have not fully addressed yet tonight, and it deserves its own attention, because it shaped the behavior of nearly every woman in Cordelia's circle in ways both subtle and profound. I am talking about the gossip columns, the society pages, and the very particular, very modern kind of public exposure they represented. Newspapers across the country by this point in the decade employ writers whose entire job consists of tracking the private lives of exactly the sort of people Cordelia dines with weekly, reporting not merely on official events, the weddings, the debuts, the charity balls, but increasingly on the unofficial ones too, who was seen where, with whom, wearing what, drinking how much. A columnist working under a pen name that has become in its own way more famous than most of the actual socialites it covers, has built an entire career out of precisely this kind of observation, and Cordelia has learned, the hard way, exactly how quickly a single evening's indiscretion can travel from a basement speakeasy to a printed page read by tens of thousands of strangers who will never meet her but will feel, after reading a single paragraph, as though they know exactly the kind of woman she is. It happened to a friend of hers, Josephine actually, the same friend who danced barefoot on that unwashed speakeasy floor, and I think the story is worth telling here because it illustrates something important about the actual cost of this era's supposed freedoms. Josephine was photographed, without her knowledge or consent, leaving a club well after midnight on the arm of a man who was decidedly not her husband, and though nothing untoward had actually occurred between them, a perfectly innocent conversation about a mutual friend that had simply run long, the photograph itself told a different, more scandalous story entirely, and the columnist covering it that week was not especially interested in letting the truth get in the way of a better one. The item ran on a Thursday. By Saturday, Josephine's own mother had called her twice, in tears both times. By the following week, 2 dinner invitations Josephine had been expecting simply never arrived. No explanation offered, none needed. It took the better part of a year and a great deal of careful, deliberate rehabilitation of her public image, strategic appearances at the right charity functions, a widely noted reconciliation dinner with her husband held somewhere she knew would be observed, before the whole incident faded sufficiently from memory for Josephine to feel, once again, fully secure in her social standing. Here is the paradox sitting right at the center of that story. The same paradox we have circled back to again and again tonight, in different forms. These were, by every visible measure, some of the freest women America had ever produced, driving their own cars, drinking in public, smoking, dancing close, discussing their unconscious minds with paid professionals, and yet every single one of those freedoms existed inside an invisible cage constructed of exactly this kind of exposure, a single photograph, a single misread glance, capable of unraveling years of carefully constructed respectability in the space of one printed column. The freedom was real. The danger surrounding it was equally real, and it fell, as these things nearly always do, considerably harder on the women than on the men standing beside them in the very same photographs. Cordelia herself has become, over the years, quite skilled at the particular art of being seen just enough and no more, present at the right speakeasy on the right night, but never lingering past the point where a photographer's flash might catch something worth printing. It is its own exhausting discipline, this constant calibration between visibility and exposure, and she has never once heard a man in her circle discuss anything remotely similar as a genuine concern in his own life. Let me take you shopping for a moment, because the actual physical world of acquiring these clothes, these hats, these endless accessories changed almost as dramatically during this decade as the clothes themselves did, and it deserves its own careful look. Cordelia does most of her shopping now at a small handful of department stores that did not exist in anything like their current form a generation earlier. Enormous, gleaming buildings occupying entire city blocks, staffed by armies of clerks trained specifically in the art of making a wealthy customer feel simultaneously flattered and slightly inadequate, the perfect combination for encouraging another purchase. She has a personal saleswoman at her preferred store, a woman named Miss Abernathy who knows Cordelia's exact measurements, her preferred colors, her husband's general moods regarding the household budget, and who telephones personally whenever a new shipment arrives that she believes Cordelia specifically would appreciate before it is displayed on the general floor for anyone else to see. There is a particular ritual to these shopping trips that I find worth describing carefully, because it involves an entire private theatre constructed for an audience of one. Cordelia is shown in a private fitting room considerably more luxurious than the fitting rooms available to ordinary customers, a curated selection of perhaps a dozen garments, each one presented by Miss Abernathy with a small, practiced speech about its particular merits. This fabric imported directly from Lyon, this cut favoured currently by a specific actress whose name alone functions as a kind of shorthand for taste, this exact shade of green nearly impossible to source this particular season. Cordelia rarely buys fewer than 4 items on any single visit, and she has never once in all her years shopping there asked to see a price tag before making her selection, because asking would itself be a small social failure, and admission that price factored into the decision at all. Fabric itself has changed considerably too, worth pausing on briefly, because the heavy brocades and stiff silks her mother's generation favoured have given way almost entirely to lighter materials, chiffon, crepe, silk jersey, fabrics that move with the body rather than holding it rigidly in place, fabrics suited precisely to a decade that wanted its women dancing rather than standing still for portraits. The dropped waist itself, that distinctive silhouette you have surely seen in photographs from this exact period, the waistline sitting low near the hips rather than at the natural waist, developed in part for genuinely practical reasons, buried underneath the fashion statement, allowing considerably more freedom of movement for exactly the kind of energetic dancing Cordelia and her friends favor at the clubs downtown. Alongside the shopping sits an entirely separate category of spending that Cordelia's mother-in-law considers, somewhat grudgingly, the truly respectable use of a wealthy woman's time, and that is charitable work, though I want to be honest with you about what that work actually looked like in practice, because it is considerably more complicated than the word charity might suggest on its own. Cordelia sits on the committee for a hospital fund, alongside perhaps a dozen other women from families exactly like her own, and the actual labour involved consists almost entirely of planning and hosting elaborate fundraising events, luncheons and balls, whose ticket prices alone would represent a significant sum to most American families, with the proceeds directed toward a hospital wing that will bear, once completed, the name of whichever family donated most generously toward it. There is a particular gala planned for the autumn that Cordelia has been organizing for months now, and she genuinely believes in the cause, believes the hospital wing will do real good for real patients who need it, and that belief exists comfortably alongside the knowledge that the entire event also functions as a highly visible demonstration of her own family's generosity that will be reported, with specific dollar figures attached, in exactly the same society pages that reported so unkindly on Josephine's midnight photograph. I do not think this makes the charitable impulse itself insincere, and I want to be careful not to suggest that it does, but it is worth noticing how thoroughly even genuine generosity, in this particular world, gets folded back into the same machinery of status and visibility that governs every other aspect of these women's lives. There was very little space in Cordelia's social world for a purely private act of kindness, one that nobody else would ever hear about or credit her for. Even the good she did was, in some sense, on display. There is another world entirely I want to bring you into now, one that intersects with Cordelia's but is not quite the same as it, and that is the world of art patronage. which flourished in a particular, fascinating way during this decade among exactly the class of people we have been spending tonight with. A handful of wealthy women in Cordelia's wider circle, though not Cordelia herself, discovered during these years a particular kind of social currency in becoming patrons of the arts, hosting salons in their private apartments where young writers and painters, most of them considerably poorer than anyone else in the room, were invited to mingle with old money and new money alike, everyone drinking the same illegal gin, everyone, for a few strange hours, occupying something close to equal footing, at least in conversation if not in circumstance. One woman in particular, a friend of Cordelia's named Adeline, whom we have not met yet tonight, has become genuinely well known in certain circles for exactly this kind of hosting. Her apartment on a Thursday evening filling reliably with a mixture of Wall Street husbands, struggling poets, at least one genuinely famous novelist who treats the whole affair with a kind of amused, slightly condescending tolerance, and on the better nights a handful of musicians and writers up from Harlem, where an extraordinary flowering of black art, literature and music is happening simultaneously, only a few miles north, in a world that intersects with Adeline's drawing room only at very particular, carefully managed moments. I think this deserves honesty rather than romance. Adeline genuinely loves the poetry she funds, genuinely believes in the young painters she buys canvases from before anyone else has heard their names, and there is real, meaningful support flowing from her checkbook into careers that might otherwise have struggled considerably harder to survive. And also, simultaneously, unmistakably, hosting these salons has made Adeline herself considerably more interesting at every other party she attends for the rest of the season, has given her a story to tell, a reputation as a woman of genuine taste and daring, rather than merely a woman of money. Both things are true, the generosity is real, so is the social calculation sitting quietly beneath it. The relationship between this white, wealthy salon culture and the extraordinary black artistic movement happening simultaneously in Harlem remains, throughout this entire decade, complicated in ways that resist any simple, comfortable summary. White patrons like Adeline provided genuine, often essential financial support to black writers and musicians who found doors closed to them almost everywhere else in publishing and the arts. And that same patronage came, more often than anyone at the time particularly wanted to examine closely, wrapped in a kind of fascination that treated black artists and their work as a form of exotic entertainment for white audiences, appreciated and consumed without ever quite extending the full social equality that appreciation might seem to imply. Adeline would tell you, sincerely, that she considers several of these artists genuine friends. Not one of them has ever been invited to her own daughter's debutante ball, and if you asked Adeline why not, I suspect she would need a long moment to answer honestly. Let me shift now, gently, towards something quieter, because not every woman in this story is young, dancing barefoot, chasing new freedoms at every turn, and I think we have spent enough of tonight in the company of youth. There is an entire generation of older women moving through this same decade, watching their daughters and granddaughters live lives they themselves would never have been permitted, and their experience of the Roaring Twenties looks considerably different. Cordelia's own mother-in-law, that same woman with the whiskey prescription and the famous bridge memory, was born in an era when a woman's entire adult identity was expected to orbit almost exclusively around her husband and children, when the very idea of a married woman driving her own automobile downtown alone would have struck most of her own peers as faintly disreputable, regardless of the destination. She has spent this entire decade in a strange, ongoing negotiation with a world that keeps reshaping itself faster than she can quite adjust to, watching hemlines rise and cigarette holders appear at her own dinner table, and her son's wife driving off alone in a roadster with an ease that still, 4 years later, makes something in her chest tighten slightly, though she has learned, mostly, to keep that tightening private. She is not simply a relic, though, and I want to resist painting her that way, because that flattens something genuinely interesting. She has her own small adaptations to this new decade, quiet ones nobody would necessarily notice unless they were paying close attention. She wears her hemlines slightly, cautiously, higher than she would have 5 years earlier. She has, twice now, allowed herself to be photographed at a charity event holding a cigarette, though never actually smoking it, simply holding it, a small concession to modernity that costs her nothing and signals, to anyone paying attention, that she is not entirely a woman of the last century either. Change, even for the women most resistant to it, arrived anyway, in small, negotiated doses, whether they fully welcomed it or not. There is one more world I want to take you through before we start winding our way toward the end of this story, and it involves ships, enormous ones, because travel itself, specifically travel across the Atlantic, becomes during this decade one of the most visible, most consuming rituals of wealthy American life, second perhaps only to the summer season in Newport in terms of sheer expense and elaborate preparation. Cordelia and her husband cross to Europe most years now, typically in the spring, aboard one of the great ocean liners that have become, in their own right, floating extensions of exactly the social world we have spent tonight inside. First-class passage on the finest of these ships costs a genuinely staggering sum, and it buys considerably more than mere transportation, an entire miniature society compressed into 5 or 6 days at sea, its own dining rooms, its own orchestra, its own rigid, carefully observed hierarchy separating first-class passengers from the considerably less comfortable accommodations several decks below, where immigrants and working travelers make the same crossing in circumstances Cordelia has never once, in all her crossings, actually witnessed with her own eyes, despite occupying the very same vessel. The purpose of these European trips, beyond simple pleasure, is substantially about acquisition, specifically the acquisition of Paris fashion at its actual source, before it has been copied, diluted, and mass-produced for the American department stores Cordelia otherwise shops at. She and several friends make a genuine pilgrimage most springs to the couture houses of Paris, sitting through private showings where models parade the newest designs before an audience of perhaps a dozen wealthy clients, each garment created specifically for the woman who orders it, fitted to her measurements alone. In fabric and detail she selects personally from an overwhelming array of options. There is a particular kind of exhaustion to these showings that Cordelia has never quite admitted to anyone. A whole afternoon spent watching beautiful clothes parade past her, while she attempts to project exactly the right degree of interested, discerning taste, neither too eager, which would seem gauche, nor too reserved, which would seem ungrateful for the considerable effort the house has put into this private presentation. She has learned, over several years of these trips, to develop a kind of practiced, slightly bored expression that somehow still manages to communicate genuine appreciation, a very specific facial performance that took her longer to master than she would ever admit out loud. The ships themselves, on the crossing home, become their own kind of performance space. Formal dinners held nightly in dining rooms, nearly as elaborate as anything found on land. Women changing outfits multiple times across a single day, morning wear giving way to afternoon tea gowns giving way, finally, to full evening dress for dinner, an entire day's labor of costume changes undertaken purely to be seen appropriately by an audience of fellow first-class passengers who are, in nearly every case, people Cordelia already knows from exactly the same dinner tables and charity balls back home. The ocean itself, vast and genuinely awe-inspiring by any honest measure, becomes almost incidental to the actual experience of the crossing, a backdrop glimpsed occasionally through a porthole between costume changes, rather than the main event. I find something worth sitting with in that particular fact, actually. The way an entire ocean, one of the genuinely magnificent things this earth contains, gets reduced almost to wallpaper by a social world so thoroughly oriented around performance that even 5 days suspended above genuine, humbling vastness cannot fully interrupt the choreography. Let me bring this back around now, though, because autumn has arrived while we have been traveling through all of this, back in New York, and the hospital gala Cordelia has spent months organizing is finally, at last, only days away. The event itself, held at one of the city's grandest hotel ballrooms, represents something close to the culmination of everything we have discussed tonight, all of it gathered under one enormous chandeliered roof for a single extraordinary evening. Cordelia has overseen every detail personally, from the exact shade of the table linens to the precise wording of the printed programs, and standing in the ballroom 2 hours before guests are due to arrive, watching the final touches being placed on an enormous floral arrangement at the center of the room, she allows herself a rare, quiet moment of something close to pride. It is not a small thing, what she has built here, even if the underlying machinery of status and visibility we discussed earlier remains threaded through every part of it. Real money will be raised tonight. A hospital wing that did not exist a year ago will exist because of tonight. Will treat real patients for decades after every single person in this ballroom has been forgotten. There is something worth honoring in that, even inside a system as complicated and self-interested as the one that produced it. By 8 that evening, the ballroom has filled entirely, nearly 400 guests moving through a room lit by 3 enormous crystal chandeliers, an orchestra playing from a raised platform at the far end, waiters circulating with trays of champagne that everyone present understands, without a single word being spoken about it, to be entirely illegal and entirely unremarkable at the exact same time. Cordelia stands near the entrance for the first half hour, greeting arrivals with a warmth that is by this point in her life close enough to genuine that she can no longer fully separate performed graciousness from actual pleasure at seeing people she has known for years. Frankie is here tonight too, on the arm of the young man whose family fortune met her mother's approval, and Evangeline, recently married, glowing in a way that could be happiness, or could simply be the particular light this ballroom is designed to flatter every face equally well. Josephine has come too, rehabilitated fully now, her reputation restored through exactly the kind of careful, deliberate social labor we discussed earlier, and she catches Cordelia's eye across the room at one point, and the two of them share a small, private smile that contains an entire unspoken history neither of them needs to say out loud. There is a moment partway through the evening, after the speeches have concluded, after the enormous sum raised has been announced from the stage to genuine applause, that I want to describe carefully because it captures something true about this whole world that a simple list of its extravagances cannot quite convey on its own. The orchestra strikes up something slow, and Cordelia's husband finds her near the edge of the dance floor and holds out his hand, not performing anything for anyone, simply asking, and she takes it, and for the length of one song, 3 minutes perhaps, the two of them dance together in the middle of a room full of people they have known and negotiated with and gossiped about for years, and for those 3 minutes, none of that seems to matter especially much. It is simply her husband's hand at her waist, the particular cologne he has worn since before they were married, the orchestra playing something neither of them could name afterward if asked. I think it is important to include that moment tonight alongside everything else, because it would be too easy, too tidy, to tell this whole story as pure spectacle and hollow performance from beginning to end. There was real affection in this world too, real tenderness, moments that had nothing to do with status or visibility at all, tucked in between the calculated ones, sometimes so close together that even the people living inside them could not always tell precisely where one ended and the other began. The evening winds down slowly after that, the way these evenings always do, guests departing in 2s and 3s, coats retrieved, cars summoned from where they have been waiting in a long, patient line outside. Cordelia and her husband are among the last to leave, staying to thank the hotel staff personally, a small habit of hers that her husband finds slightly unnecessary and has stopped commenting on years ago. Their drive home is quiet. New York at this hour, well past midnight now, has its own particular texture, streets nearly empty, street lamps casting long pools of light across pavement still faintly warm from the day, the occasional other car passing in the opposite direction, its own passengers presumably returning from some equivalent evening somewhere else in this enormous, restless city. Cordelia rests her head against the window and watches the buildings slide past, feeling the particular, familiar exhaustion that follows any evening of sustained performance, even a genuinely enjoyable one. She thinks, somewhere around 59th Street, about Ruth, waiting up for her despite the late hour, despite Cordelia having told her more than once that she need not stay awake for this. She thinks about Whitcomb, up in Newport now for the off-season, keeping that enormous empty cottage ready for a family that will not return until next June. She thinks, briefly, about the ice swan from that garden party months ago, melting slowly in the summer heat while a servant stood nearby monitoring its collapse, and she is not entirely sure why that particular image has stayed with her all these months later, resurfacing now, unbidden, in the quiet dark of a car winding its way home past midnight. Let me take you forward a few months now, to the very end of that same year, because there is one more evening worth understanding before we settle into the quiet close of tonight's story, and it is the biggest, loudest evening of the entire wealthy social calendar, New Year's Eve. Cordelia's circle does not celebrate the turning of the year quietly, and by this point in tonight's story that should not surprise you at all. The party she and her husband attend this particular year is hosted by a couple considerably wealthier even than most of the guests they usually mix with, in an apartment occupying an entire floor of one of the newer buildings rising along Park Avenue, ceilings high enough to accommodate a genuine live evergreen tree strung with electric lights, a novelty still new enough that several older guests spend a portion of the evening simply staring up at it, marveling quietly at electric bulbs replacing what would have been dangerous open candles on a tree just a decade earlier. The scale of this particular party exceeds even the hospital gala. Somehow, 600 guests moving through rooms that seem, despite their genuine enormity, to grow more crowded and more electric as midnight approaches. There are 2 orchestras tonight, alternating sets so the music never once stops, and a supply of champagne so lavish that Cordelia finds herself wondering, briefly, cynically, exactly how many federal agents would need to be paid to look the other way for an evening of this particular scale, though she keeps that particular thought entirely to herself. At 1:45, something shifts through the crowd, an anticipation building the way it always does in the final minutes of any year, and Cordelia finds herself standing near a tall window overlooking the avenue below, her husband's arm around her waist, watching the street lamps stretch away into the dark in both directions. There is a particular kind of vertigo in these moments, standing at the exact hinge between one year and the next, that she has felt every single New Year's Eve of her adult life, and has never quite gotten used to, a sense of time itself becoming briefly, strangely visible, something you could almost reach out and touch if you stretched your hand out far enough. The countdown itself, when it comes, is loud and joyful and slightly ridiculous. 400 voices counting down together in a room full of borrowed time and illegal champagne. And when midnight actually arrives, when the room erupts into noise and embracing and a great scattering of confetti that will take the household staff the better part of the following week to fully clean from every corner of that apartment, Cordelia kisses her husband and feels, for one genuine, uncomplicated moment, simply happy, without any of the careful calibration and performance that has threaded through nearly every other scene we have visited tonight. I want to leave that moment mostly alone, actually, rather than immediately complicating it with everything else we know about this world. Sometimes a happy moment is simply a happy moment, even inside a system built on spectacle and inequality and careful, exhausting performance. Cordelia will go back, tomorrow, to the calculations and the fittings and the careful management of her own visibility. But tonight, at the exact hinge of the year, she is simply a woman kissing her husband in a crowded room, and that particular truth does not need to be undermined by anything else in order to be real. Here is something worth knowing, though. Something the people in that Park Avenue apartment could not possibly have known that particular midnight, dancing and drinking and watching electric lights twinkle on an evergreen tree taller than most of their own front doors. This decade, this entire glittering, reckless, contradictory era we have spent tonight exploring, has less than 2 full years left to run before the whole enormous structure comes crashing down with a suddenness that will genuinely stagger nearly everyone standing in that room tonight. The market that Cordelia's husband watches so intently, the one that seemed, to nearly everyone in her circle, to represent some permanent, effortless engine of ever-increasing wealth, will collapse catastrophically within 2 years, and fortunes built across decades will evaporate within a matter of weeks, taking with them a great many of the very rituals and extravagances we have spent this entire evening walking through together. I do not say this to cast a shadow backward over everything we have already visited tonight, and I want to be careful here, because that is not the spirit in which I want to leave you. I mention it only because I think there is something worth noticing in how little any of them knew, standing there at midnight with confetti in their hair, that this particular kind of glittering, careless abundance was already, quietly, running out its final months. They believed, as people in every era before a great collapse tend to believe, that the good times they were living inside had simply become the new, permanent shape of the world. Let me tell you briefly and gently what eventually became of a few of the people we have spent tonight getting to know. Not to dwell on hardship, but because I think it rounds out the story honestly, and because there is something quietly moving in knowing how these particular lives actually unfolded. Cordelia and her husband weathered the eventual collapse better than many of their friends. Not unscathed, but intact. Their fortune diminished considerably, yet never entirely destroyed. And Cordelia would say, decades later, to a granddaughter curious about her youth, that the years immediately following were the first time in her adult life she had genuinely learned to manage a household budget with her own two hands, a skill she came, somewhat to her own surprise, to take real quiet pride in. Josephine's marriage, the one so nearly undone by a single misread photograph, ended anyway, several years later, for reasons that had nothing to do with gossip columns at all, and she moved to California of all places, and by every account available, built there a life considerably happier than the one she left behind in New York. Frankie married the young man whose family fortune her mother had so carefully approved, and their marriage was, by the honest accounts of people who knew them both, a genuinely contented one, built slowly into something real that neither the elaborate debut nor the careful negotiations that preceded it could have entirely predicted or guaranteed on their own. Whitcomb served that Newport family for 11 more years after the summer we visited tonight, retiring finally to a small cottage of his own on the same property, granted to him by a family whose gratitude, whatever its limits, was in this particular case genuine and lasting. I tell you all of this not to tie the evening up too neatly, because life rarely allows for that kind of neatness, but because I think there is something worth carrying with you as we ease toward the close of tonight's story. These were real people, or people built carefully enough from real historical patterns to stand in honestly for the ones who actually lived through exactly this world, and their lives continued on well past the glittering, contradictory decade we have spent tonight inside, carrying forward pieces of it, shedding other pieces, becoming, gradually, something neither entirely the same nor entirely different from who they had been at the height of all that abundance. Let me bring you back one final time to a single quiet object, because I think it deserves its own attention before we close, and it is small enough, ordinary enough, that it has slipped past us tonight without quite getting the moment it deserves. The calling card. Every woman in Cordelia's circle carries a small case of them, engraved cards bearing nothing but her name, exchanged according to a set of rules so intricate that entire chapters of etiquette manuals are devoted to them alone. A card left with one corner turned down means something different from a card left flat. A visit paid within the correct window of time after receiving an invitation signals proper respect. A card left by a servant rather than delivered personally carries its own precise, unspoken meaning, understood instantly by whoever receives it without a single word needing to be exchanged. This entire elaborate silent language, the product of generations of careful social evolution, is already, quietly, becoming obsolete by the time we leave Cordelia tonight, replaced gradually by the telephone call we discussed earlier, by the increasing informality this whole decade has ushered into nearly every corner of upper-class life. Cordelia still keeps her cards, still uses them occasionally, out of habit as much as necessity, but she notices, if she is honest, that fewer and fewer of her friends bother with the old rules anymore, that a telephone call now accomplishes in 30 seconds what an exchange of cards once required days or weeks to properly complete. There is something worth sitting with in that small, unremarkable fact, the way an entire elaborate social language, mastered so completely by women like Cordelia's mother, that it structured nearly every visit and every friendship according to its silent grammar, simply, gradually, fades from use within the span of a single generation, replaced by something faster and less formal, until eventually nobody quite remembers the specific meaning of a turned-down corner at all, and the whole intricate system survives only in old etiquette manuals gathering dust on library shelves, artifacts of a language nobody speaks anymore. I want to spend some real time now on Ruth, because we have mentioned her tonight several times without ever properly stopping to consider her own life, and I think that omission says something worth correcting, since her world sat only a few feet away from Cordelia's for the entirety of this story, separated by a single flight of servants' stairs and an entire universe of circumstance. Ruth is 29 this year, 3 years older than Cordelia, though nobody in the household would ever guess it from how the two women are treated relative to each other. She grew up in Brooklyn, the daughter of a dock worker and a woman who took in laundry, and she left school at 14 to help support her family, a fact Cordelia knows only in the vaguest possible outline, mentioned once, years ago, in a conversation neither of them has returned to since. Ruth has worked in service since she was 16, first for a considerably less generous family than Cordelia's, then, for the past 6 years, here in a household that she would describe, if asked honestly by someone she actually trusted, as a genuinely fair one, better than most, though fair is a relative term when your entire waking life is structured around another woman's schedule rather than your own. Her day begins considerably earlier than Cordelia's, well before dawn most mornings, laying fires, preparing the household for a day that will not properly begin, from Cordelia's perspective, until nearly noon. Ruth has her own small room on the top floor of the house, sparse but private, a genuine luxury compared to the shared servants' quarters she endured in her previous position, and she has, tucked into the drawer of her own narrow dresser, a small collection of things that belong entirely to her, a photograph of her mother, a letter from a brother currently working out west on the railroads, a few coins saved carefully toward a future she thinks about more than she lets herself dwell on during working hours. There is a man Ruth has been quietly seeing for the better part of a year, a delivery driver named Samuel, who brings ice to the house twice weekly and has on several of those visits lingered rather longer at the kitchen door than strictly necessary for the transaction of ice alone. Cordelia has no idea this romance exists, has never once thought to wonder whether her lady's maid might have an entire private emotional life running parallel to her own, full of its own hopes and uncertainties, and small, stolen moments of tenderness snatched during the brief windows when the household does not require her attention. This is, I think, one of the quieter tragedies of the world we have spent tonight inside, not a dramatic one, not the kind that makes headlines or gossip columns, simply the plain, ordinary fact that an entire rich, complicated human life can exist just a few feet away from another one, tending to its every need with genuine skill and care, and remain almost completely invisible to the person it serves. Ruth does not resent Cordelia, not exactly, though there are certainly moments, watching Cordelia complain about the exhausting burden of choosing between two nearly identical evening gowns, when something considerably sharper than simple patience flickers briefly behind Ruth's carefully composed expression before she smooths it away again, a professional habit so deeply ingrained by now that it happens almost without conscious effort. She has her own dreams for what comes next in her own life, a small shop of her own eventually, perhaps, sewing and alterations, built slowly from the savings tucked into that dresser drawer, a life that would belong entirely, unmistakably, to her alone rather than to the rhythms and requirements of someone else's household. Whether Ruth ever achieves that particular dream is not a story I can tell you with certainty tonight, because the historical record, unlike the elaborate diaries and letters left behind by women like Cordelia, rarely preserves the interior lives of women like Ruth with anything approaching the same detail. That gap itself, the way we know so much about the ice swans and the diamond headbands, and comparatively so little about the actual inner lives of the women who polished the silver and pinned the hems and kept these glittering households running, is its own quiet, important piece of this entire decade's history, one worth sitting with honestly rather than smoothing over in favor of a more purely glamorous telling. I wanted to give her that space tonight at least, before we close. A few minutes out of everything we have spent together, belonging entirely to Ruth and to the countless women like her whose names rarely made it into the diaries and the gossip columns at all. Let me tell you about one more ritual before we start easing toward the close of tonight's story, because it connects directly back to those calling cards we discussed a few minutes ago, and it structured an entire slice of Cordelia's week, in a way that modern life has no real equivalent for anymore. Every fashionable woman of Cordelia's standing maintains what is called an at-home day, a single specific afternoon each week, always the same one, printed discreetly on her calling cards for anyone who needs to know it. during which she is formally available to receive visitors without any prior arrangement being necessary. Cordelia's is Wednesday, from 3 until 5, and on those particular Wednesday afternoons, her entire household reorganizes itself around the possibility, never quite a certainty, that anywhere from 2 to 15 women might arrive across those 2 hours expecting tea, conversation, and a level of hospitality that must be sustained gracefully regardless of how many or how few actually appear. There is a particular anxiety specific to at-home days that Cordelia has never fully gotten used to, even after years of hosting them, the anxiety of an empty parlor. A Wednesday with only 1 or 2 callers signals something uncomfortable about her current standing, a suggestion, however unfair, that she has slipped somehow in the invisible rankings that govern this entire social world. A well-attended at-home day, by contrast, parlor full, conversation overlapping, the good china pressed into service for the 3rd time that month, functions as its own small, reassuring proof that she still matters, that her Wednesday afternoons remain worth an interruption in anyone else's own carefully managed week. Ruth prepares for these Wednesdays nearly as carefully as she prepares Cordelia herself, laying out the good tea service, arranging fresh flowers, ensuring a rotation of small sandwiches and cakes sits ready in the kitchen regardless of whether 2 guests or 12 actually materialize, because running short during an at-home day would represent its own small, mortifying failure, one that would circulate through the gossip network with startling speed by the following week. The conversation itself during these Wednesday afternoons follows its own unspoken rules, light, social, carefully avoiding anything genuinely personal or contentious. An entire 2 hours conducted almost like a extended, elaborate small talk performed by women who, in many cases, know each other's real circumstances quite intimately, but have collectively agreed, by unspoken consensus, to discuss none of it directly during these particular gatherings. Cordelia has sat through countless Wednesday afternoons, trading pleasantries with a woman she happens to know, through the reliable underground network of servants' gossip, is currently facing serious financial difficulty, both of them maintaining, with total commitment, the fiction that everything remains perfectly, comfortably fine. There is something almost theatrical about the whole institution, when you step back and actually examine it, an entire weekly performance of availability and hospitality and unbothered ease, staged specifically for an audience that already knows, in most cases, that the performance is exactly that, a performance, and chooses collectively to participate in it anyway, because the alternative, actual honesty about the difficulties and anxieties running beneath every one of these households, would collapse the whole delicate social structure these women have spent their entire lives learning to manage. Let me shift now to something gentler, a memory rather than a weekly obligation, because I think we are close now to the point in tonight's story where the pace should slow considerably, and this particular memory belongs to that slower register. Cordelia and her husband honeymooned, 6 years ago now, at a resort in the mountains that catered specifically to newly married couples of exactly their social standing, an entire industry having developed around the specific ritual of the wealthy honeymoon, resorts and hotels competing to offer the most private, most romantic, most photograph-worthy setting for a young couple's first weeks of marriage. She remembers, more clearly than almost anything else from those weeks, a particular morning early in the trip, waking before her new husband for once, and lying quietly beside him, watching mountain light move slowly across the ceiling of their room, feeling, for perhaps the first time in her adult life, entirely unobserved, entirely free of the performance that had structured every single day leading up to that wedding. It did not last, of course, that particular feeling of total privacy, and by the time they returned to New York a few weeks later, the familiar machinery of visibility and obligation had reasserted itself almost immediately, calling cards to be exchanged, thank you notes to be written for an overwhelming quantity of wedding gifts, an at-home day to resume on schedule. But she still thinks, sometimes, about that particular quiet morning in the mountains, mountain light on a ceiling, nobody watching, nothing required of her at all, beyond simply existing quietly beside the man she had just married. I think everyone, regardless of the century they happen to live in, carries at least one memory exactly like that one, a brief window of total unwatched peace, tucked somewhere private, return to occasionally when the ordinary performance of life grows especially heavy. Before we settle all the way into the close of tonight's story, I want to give you one more thread, because it connects several of the people we have already met tonight, and it involves a particular kind of courtship ritual that changed almost as dramatically during this decade as everything else we have discussed. A generation earlier, courtship among families like Cordelia's operated under a system of chaperonage so thorough that a young unmarried woman was rarely permitted to spend even a few minutes genuinely alone with a young man she might eventually marry. A chaperone, usually an older female relative or a paid companion, accompanied nearly every interaction, sitting within earshot at every visit, present at every carriage ride, ensuring that whatever affection eventually developed between two young people developed entirely within full view of a watchful third party. By the time Frankie is navigating her own courtship, several years after her debutante ball, that system has loosened considerably, though not nearly as completely as popular memory of this decade often suggests. Frankie is permitted by this point to ride alone in an automobile with a young man she is being courted by, a freedom that would have been genuinely scandalous only 15 years earlier. And she is permitted to attend certain dances and parties without a formal chaperone present at all, provided she is part of a larger group of friends rather than genuinely alone. But the underlying machinery of approval has not disappeared, merely shifted its visible form. Her mother still requires a full accounting of any young man showing serious interest, his family's standing, his prospects, his own personal conduct as reported through the same reliable gossip network that governs nearly everything else in this world. A young man can take Frankie for a drive unchaperoned now, but he cannot, under any circumstances, escape knowing that every single detail of that drive will likely reach her mother within a matter of days regardless. The engagement itself, when it finally comes, follows its own precise choreography. The young man approaches Frankie's father first, a private conversation conducted usually over brandy in a study very much like the one hiding Cordelia's own husband's wine cellar, requesting formal permission before ever presenting a ring. The ring itself, once offered, is expected to be substantial, a diamond of a size and quality that functions as its own small, unmistakable announcement of the family's means, displayed prominently at every social gathering in the weeks following the engagement, examined and quietly assessed by every woman who catches sight of it. There is a particular legal mechanism worth mentioning here too, one that shaped courtship behavior in ways modern audiences rarely think about. A woman jilted after a formal engagement, left at the altar or abandoned once the ring had already been given and the wedding announced, retained, under the laws of this era, the ability to sue for what was called breach of promise, a genuine legal action seeking financial compensation for the humiliation and damaged prospects such an abandonment caused. These lawsuits, when they occurred among families of Cordelia's standing, became instant, devastating gossip column fodder, and the mere threat of one functioned as its own quiet deterrent, ensuring that a formal engagement, once announced publicly, carried real consequences for a man who might otherwise have considered backing out of it. Let me shift now to something considerably warmer, because courtship rituals and legal deterrents are not quite the note I want to end on before we ease towards sleep. And there is a particular holiday tradition worth including here, one that ran through nearly every household we have visited tonight. Christmas in Cordelia's household unfolds across the better part of 2 full weeks, beginning with an enormous tree, always real, always fresh cut and delivered by a supplier who has served this particular family for over a decade, erected in the front parlor and decorated not by Cordelia herself, but by Ruth and 2 other servants, working carefully under Cordelia's occasional, mostly decorative supervision. The ornaments themselves have accumulated across the length of Cordelia's marriage, a mixture of delicate glass pieces brought back from various European trips, and a handful of considerably simpler ornaments that belonged to her own mother, the only objects in the entire house. Cordelia has sometimes thought privately that connect this glittering, modern life she has built to the considerably more modest childhood she rarely discusses at dinner parties. Gift-giving among Cordelia's circle has become, over the course of this decade, its own small competitive sport, and there is a particular unspoken understanding that gifts exchanged between women of equivalent social standing should be impressive without ever quite outshining the giver's own household. A delicate balance requiring real social calculation dressed up as generosity. The children of the household, and there are children in several of the families we have touched on tonight, though we have kept our attention mostly on the adult women, receive gifts in a quantity and quality that would have seemed almost unimaginable a generation earlier. Imported toys, small versions of adult luxuries, a miniature motor car for one particularly fortunate nephew that costs more than most working families would spend on gifts across an entire decade. There is one more small collection of objects I want to walk you through before we finally let this story rest, because they sit scattered through nearly every scene we have visited tonight without ever quite getting their own proper introduction, and I think they deserve it. The evening bag Cordelia carried to the hospital gala, small and beaded, barely large enough to hold a compact, a folded handkerchief, and a single cigarette in its slim case, represents its own small evolution worth noting. A generation earlier, a woman's evening accessories were built for a world in which she carried almost nothing herself, everything of practical necessity handled instead by whoever accompanied her. The tiny beaded bags fashionable now assume a woman who needs at minimum her own powder and her own cigarettes readily at hand, unwilling to depend on anyone else to produce them at the appropriate moment. Fans still make their appearance at the most formal occasions, though considerably less central to a woman's evening than they were for her mother's generation, when an entire silent language existed around exactly how a fan was held, opened or gestured with, communicating messages between a woman and a suitor across a crowded ballroom without a single word being spoken. That particular language has faded nearly to nothing by the time Cordelia carries her own fan, more decorative accessory now than genuine tool of communication, though her mother-in-law still remembers and occasionally demonstrates with a faintly wistful precision exactly what a fan held a certain way once meant to a young man watching from across the room. Furs deserve their own mention too, because a woman's fur collection functioned, throughout this entire decade, as one of the most immediately legible signals of her family's wealth, visible even from a distance, recognizable even to someone who knew nothing else about her. Cordelia owns 3 coats she considers genuinely significant: a mink acquired as a wedding gift from her own mother, a fox stole she wears draped loosely over evening gowns in a style considered particularly modern this season, and a sable her husband gave her on their 5th anniversary that she still, 4 years later, handles with a kind of careful reverence she extends to almost nothing else in her considerable wardrobe. Let me take you finally to one more setting before we ease into the close of tonight's story, a country house weekend, because it represents its own particular ritual, distinct from the summer season in Newport we spent so much time inside earlier tonight. These weekend gatherings, hosted at estates within a few hours' drive of the city, brought together a smaller, more curated group than the enormous balls and galas we have visited tonight, perhaps a dozen guests arriving Friday evening and departing Sunday afternoon, and they operated according to their own particular rhythm, considerably more relaxed on the surface, while remaining, underneath, every bit as socially calculated as anything else in this world. Cordelia has attended perhaps a dozen of these weekends over the years, and she has come to understand them as their own distinct art form, an extended, multi-day performance of effortless ease that actually requires enormous coordination behind the scenes to sustain properly. The host family's staff prepares an entirely separate wardrobe consideration for a weekend like this, because a guest is expected to change outfits with a frequency that would exhaust anyone unfamiliar with the custom morning tweeds for whatever outdoor activity the day includes, a fresh outfit for afternoon tea, another entirely for the more casual dinner Friday evening, and full formal evening dress for the considerably grander dinner held Saturday night, the genuine centerpiece of the entire weekend. Cordelia's trunk for a single weekend like this often contains more clothing, carefully packed by Ruth days in advance, than many working families would own across an entire year. There is a particular quality to the conversation during these weekends that differs meaningfully from the more formal dinner parties we discussed earlier tonight, a bit more candid, a bit more willing to venture into genuine opinion and disagreement, precisely because the setting itself, removed from the city, surrounded by only a small, trusted circle, rather than the wider social world, offers a rare kind of privacy that a crowded ballroom simply cannot. Cordelia has had some of her most honest conversations of any given year during exactly these weekends. Late at night, after the formal dinner has concluded, a small handful of guests lingering in a drawing room with brandy and cigarettes, the performance finally, briefly, allowed to ease just slightly, though never quite disappearing entirely. Not even here. One more small ritual is worth mentioning before we finally let the story rest, a quieter one, involving paper and ink rather than diamonds or champagne. And I think it belongs here precisely because of how ordinary it is. Every gift Cordelia receives, every dinner invitation she accepts, every small kindness extended to her across the length of a given month, requires a handwritten note of thanks, composed on stationery bearing her own engraved initials, and this particular obligation occupies a genuinely significant portion of her week, considerably more than most people today would imagine. She keeps a small writing desk in her sitting room specifically for this purpose, stocked always with fresh paper, ink and a blotter, and there are certain mornings, following an especially social week, when she sits at that desk for the better part of 2 hours, working steadily through a stack of correspondence that has accumulated faster than she can properly keep pace with it. The rules governing these notes are, predictably, every bit as precise as the rules governing nearly everything else we have discussed tonight. A note must be sent within a specific window of days following whatever occasion prompted it. Later than that window, and the delay itself becomes a small, noted slight. The wording must strike an exact balance between warmth and restraint, effusive enough to seem genuinely grateful, restrained enough not to seem overly familiar with a hostess who might, depending on the relationship, deserve a more formal register entirely. Cordelia has, over years of practice, developed a kind of fluency in this particular form of writing, capable of producing a note that reads as entirely spontaneous and heartfelt, while actually following a structure nearly as fixed as a legal document. I find something worth noticing in the sheer volume of labor this particular ritual required. Hours upon hours across a given month spent producing paper that would, in most cases, be read once, briefly, and then set aside or discarded entirely. And yet the ritual persisted, unquestioned, because the alternative, a gift or kindness left formally unacknowledged, represented its own small breach in the delicate social fabric holding this entire world together. Let me mention hats too, briefly, because they deserve at least a moment of their own attention tonight. The cloche, that close-fitting, bell-shaped style that has become almost a uniform among fashionable women this decade, sits low over the forehead, nearly to the eyebrows, in a way that requires the particular short, sleek hairstyle we discussed earlier tonight simply to fit properly at all. Cordelia owns perhaps 15 of them in various colors and fabrics, felt for winter, straw for summer, each one selected with the same careful attention she applies to nearly every other visible element of her wardrobe, because a hat, more than almost any other single garment, announces a woman's taste and status from a considerable distance, long before anyone can examine the finer details of her dress or her jewelry. Her milliner, a small exacting French woman with a shop 2 blocks from the department store where Miss Abernathy manages Cordelia's clothing, knows the precise shape of Cordelia's head as intimately as Ruth knows the precise shape of her waist, and there is a particular pleasure Cordelia takes in these fittings that differs from the pleasure of choosing a gown, something quieter and more private about a hat, an object that will frame her face specifically, individually, in a way no other garment quite manages. The theatre occupies its own particular evening ritual too, worth a brief mention before we close. Cordelia and her husband attending regularly, always in the same particular box seats, purchased for the entire season rather than individual performances, positioned specifically where the rest of the audience can see them nearly as clearly as they can see the stage itself, because being seen attending the theatre carries very nearly as much social weight as whatever performance is actually unfolding below. Cordelia has, on more than one occasion, found herself entirely unable to recall the plot of a play she watched only the week before, while remembering with perfect clarity exactly who occupied the neighbouring box, and exactly what that neighbour happened to be wearing. One last small thing before we close, and then I promise we will let Cordelia finally rest. Scent. Perfume changed considerably during this decade too, following roughly the same trajectory as nearly everything else we have discussed tonight, moving away from the light, single flower scents her mother's generation favored towards something considerably bolder, more abstract, blended from dozens of different notes into a single complex signature rather than a straightforward imitation of a rose or a violet. Cordelia wears a scent created originally in Paris a few years earlier, one that became, almost overnight, the single most recognizable perfume among women of her exact social standing, worn by so many of her friends simultaneously that walking into a crowded ballroom sometimes produces a strange, disorienting effect. Dozens of women wearing what is technically the same fragrance, each one somehow smelling slightly different once it meets her own particular skin and warmth. She remembers the specific afternoon she first tried it, in a small shop during one of those Paris trips we discussed earlier, a saleswoman applying a single drop to the inside of her wrist and instructing her to wait, not to judge the scent immediately, but to let it develop across the following hour as it warmed against her own skin, and Cordelia remembers being genuinely startled by how much it changed across that hour, sharp and slightly medicinal at first, then softening gradually into something warmer, muskier, considerably more sensuous than anything she had worn before that particular afternoon. Winter brings its own small ritual too, one we have not touched on yet tonight, because Cordelia's circle has, in just the past few years, discovered an enthusiasm for skiing, a sport barely known at all among wealthy Americans a decade earlier, imported now from fashionable European resorts, and quickly adopted by exactly the kind of people who adopt anything a European aristocrat has been photographed doing recently. Cordelia herself has taken to it only reluctantly, finding the whole enterprise considerably colder and more physically demanding than she anticipated, though she has learned, over 2 winters of practice, to manage a gentle slope with reasonable competence, dressed in a snug wool outfit designed specifically for the sport, another small addition to a wardrobe that seems to expand endlessly to accommodate whatever new activity this restless, inventive decade produces next. There is something almost dizzying, honestly, when you step back and consider the sheer accumulation of novelty crowded into these few years. Automobiles and radios and telephones and skiing and jazz and psychoanalysis and Reno divorces, an entire world reinventing itself at a pace that must have felt, to anyone living through it, genuinely breathless, one innovation arriving before the previous one had even fully settled into ordinary life. Cordelia has lived through more visible change in this single decade than her grandmother experienced across 60 years, and she has absorbed nearly all of it with the same practiced, unruffled ease she brings to selecting the correct fork, treating each new marvel, each new freedom, each new obligation as simply the next thing a woman of her standing is expected to master. And there is one final detail I want to leave you with before we let all of this rest. A small one, easy to miss, but I think it captures something true about the entire evening we have spent together tonight, better than almost anything else could. Downstairs, in the kitchen, long after Cordelia has gone up to bed and Ruth has retreated to her own small room, the cook, a heavy-set, capable woman named Mrs. Doyle, who has fed this family faithfully for 9 years, sits alone for a few minutes at the scrubbed wooden table, the last person still awake in the entire house, drinking a cup of tea she made for herself rather than for anyone else, in a kitchen finally, blessedly quiet after a day of feeding an entire household, and, tonight, an entire gala's worth of preparation before that. She does this most nights, this brief solitary cup of tea, before finally climbing her own stairs to bed, and it is, in its own small way, the only truly unwatched, unrequired moment in her entire day, belonging to nobody but herself. I like knowing that this moment existed, somewhere underneath all the glitter and performance we have spent tonight examining. A woman sitting quietly with her own tea in her own kitchen, needing nothing from anyone, expected to produce nothing for anyone, simply resting for a few private minutes before the whole enormous, glittering machine of that household would require her again in just a few short hours. There is a version of peace available even inside the most demanding, most watched lives, tucked into small corners nobody else ever notices, and I think that is worth remembering, whatever decade you happen to be living in, whatever version of performance your own days require of you. That is where I want to leave this story tonight, in that quiet kitchen, in that dim bedroom upstairs, in all the small unwatched corners where these women, wealthy and working alike, finally set down whatever they had been carrying all day and simply briefly rested. Let us return one final time to Cordelia's bedroom, because that is where we began tonight, and I think it is the right place to end as well. Though considerably later in the day this time, well past midnight, the particular hour when a household like hers finally, fully goes quiet. Ruth is waiting when Cordelia comes upstairs, exactly as she has every single night for 6 years, and there is a particular tenderness in this specific nightly ritual that I want to describe slowly, because it is easy to rush past in favor of more dramatic scenes, and I think it deserves better than being rushed past. Cordelia sits at her dressing table, and Ruth stands behind her, and together, without needing to discuss any of it, they begin the long, careful process of undoing everything the day required. The diamond headband comes off first, Ruth's fingers finding the small clasp at the back with practiced ease, and Cordelia feels the particular relief of pressure released from her forehead, a headache she had not fully registered as a headache until this exact moment when it begins, finally, to ease. The pearls follow, unwound from around her throat, coiled carefully into their velvet-lined box, several ropes of it looking considerably smaller and less impressive, folded into a drawer than they did catching candlelight across a crowded ballroom only hours earlier. The earrings, the rings, each one slipped off finger by finger and set carefully into their own compartment, because a misplaced ring is exactly the kind of small domestic catastrophe that can consume an entire following morning. Ruth unhooks the back of the evening dress next, a long column of tiny buttons that took the better part of 10 minutes to fasten earlier that evening, and comes undone now in considerably less time. Practiced hands moving quickly through a task performed so many hundreds of times that it requires almost no conscious attention at all. Cordelia steps out of the dress, and Ruth catches it before it can crumple on the floor, hanging it with immediate automatic care, because a dress that costs what this one cost does not get treated carelessly regardless of the hour or the exhaustion involved. The chest binding comes off next, and Cordelia feels her breath deepen almost involuntarily the moment the fabric releases. The particular flat, boyish silhouette, so carefully constructed each morning, simply dissolving back into whatever shape her body actually wants to be, when nobody is asking it to perform anything else. She has never quite decided whether she finds this nightly unwinding more of a relief or a kind of small, quiet grief, the return to her own actual body feeling. Some nights, almost like meeting a stranger she used to know better. Last of all, always last, comes the face. Cordelia sits while Ruth works a thick cream into her skin, dissolving the careful architecture of powder and rouge and dark, dramatic eye makeup built up so precisely earlier that evening, and beneath it, slowly, her actual face reappears, tired around the eyes, a small crease forming between her brows that no amount of cream has ever quite managed to erase, the face of a 28-year-old woman who has spent an entire decade so far learning to perform a version of herself just slightly more polished, more visible, more carefully composed than whatever she actually feels like underneath it on any given ordinary night. Ruth says goodnight and slips out quietly, closing the door behind her with the particular soft click of someone who has closed exactly this door, exactly this way, hundreds of times before. And Cordelia sits alone for a moment longer at her dressing table, looking at her own bare face in the mirror, unadorned, uncomplicated, entirely, finally, off-duty. I think there is something worth carrying with you from this exact image, actually, more than almost anything else we have discussed tonight. Underneath every glittering surface we have spent this evening exploring, the diamonds and the ice swans and the illegal champagne and the carefully calculated visibility, there was, always, a real woman, tired at the end of a long day, sitting quietly in front of a mirror, wanting nothing more complicated than a soft bed and a few hours of genuine rest before the whole elaborate performance began again the following morning. That particular want, simple and human and entirely unglamorous, connects Cordelia across an entire century to you, listening now, wherever you are tonight, however different your own life looks from hers. She climbs into bed a few minutes later, the sheets cool against skin that spent the whole evening wrapped in silk and boning and careful expectation, and she lies there in the dark for a while, listening to the particular quiet of a large house finally settling for the night, Floorboards easing, a radiator ticking somewhere down the hall, the faint, distant sound of the city itself never quite going fully silent even at this hour. Somewhere below her, Ruth is climbing her own narrow staircase toward her own small room, and somewhere across the city, Josephine is doing something similar, and Frankie, married now, is asleep already beside a husband she is slowly, genuinely coming to love. An entire city full of women, tired at the end of an elaborate contradictory decade, easing finally into rest. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a room like this one, at exactly this hour, heavier and softer than the silence of any other time of day, and I want to sit inside it with you for a while longer before we let this story close completely, because I think there is something in this whole strange, glittering decade worth carrying forward. Something beyond the diamonds and the gin and the careful, exhausting performance of visibility we have spent tonight walking through together. These women, Cordelia and Ruth and Frankie and Evangeline and Josephine and all the others whose names we did not have time to properly learn tonight, lived inside a world built almost entirely on contradiction, and I do not think that contradiction ever really resolved itself, not for them, not within the span of this particular decade. They were freer than any generation of American women before them, driving their own cars, drinking in public, cutting their hair short as an act of open defiance against everything their mothers had been taught to value, discussing their own unconscious minds with paid professionals in quiet East Side offices, and they were, at the very same time, bound by rules every bit as intricate and unforgiving as the ones governing their grandmothers, watched constantly, judged endlessly, their entire worth still measured, in the end, against a marriage market and a social hierarchy that had shifted its surface considerably more than it had shifted its foundations. I do not think this makes their freedom fake, exactly, though I understand the temptation to describe it that way. I think it makes it real and limited at the same time, which is, if you sit with it long enough, probably true of most freedoms in most eras, including quite possibly our own. Progress rarely arrives all at once, complete and unambiguous. It arrives in fragments, a shorter hemline here, a private telephone line there, a woman driving herself downtown for the very first time while her mother worries on the other end of a telephone call about what the neighbors will think. Each fragment matters, none of them, on its own, was ever quite the whole story. What strikes me most, turning all of this over one final time before we let it rest for the night, is how much of what felt genuinely modern and unprecedented to Cordelia and her friends would look, from where you and I are sitting tonight, both remarkably familiar and remarkably distant all at once. The anxiety about how one appears to others, the exhausting performance of effortlessness, the private grief tucked carefully behind a composed public face, the quiet, ongoing negotiation between who you actually are and who the world expects you to present yourself as. None of that has really gone away in the century since Cordelia unclipped her diamond headband and let Ruth wipe the day's careful architecture from her face. We have simply built new versions of the same old performance, with new tools, new mirrors, new audiences watching from new distances, and maybe that is the gentlest place to leave this story tonight. Not with judgment of Cordelia's world or admiration of it either, but simply with recognition. A woman tired at the end of a long, glittering, complicated day, wanting nothing more than rest. That particular want has not changed in 100 years, and it will not change in the 100 years still to come. It is in its own quiet way one of the most durable things about being human, this simple, universal need to finally, at the end of everything, put the performance down and just be tired and warm and unwatched and safe enough to close your eyes. So let this be where we leave the Roaring Twenties tonight, love. Not at a party, not mid-dance, not dressed in beads and diamonds under a chandelier, but here, in this quiet, dim room, a woman drifting towards sleep beside a husband who does not stir, a whole restless, contradictory decade finally, gently, going still around her. And maybe you can let yourself do the same thing right now. Whatever performance your own day required of you, whatever version of yourself you had to build and maintain and present carefully to the world since you woke up this morning, you do not need any of it right now. Nobody is watching. Nobody is grading the fork you reached for or the hemline you chose, or the version of your own face you presented to whoever needed to see it today. It is just you now, here, warm under your blanket, exactly as tired and exactly as human as Cordelia was, sitting at her own mirror 100 years ago, letting the day finally, fully dissolve. I am so glad you spent this time with me tonight. If any small piece of this story stayed with you, a detail about the ice swan, or the calling cards, or Ruth's quiet, unseen life tucked just a few feet away from all that glitter, I would love to hear about it whenever you have a moment, in a comment, whenever this reaches you. But for now, there is nothing left to do at all. Just let your eyes close, let your breathing slow, let the last 100 years dissolve quietly away, the way they always eventually do, and rest now, love. You have earned it. Good night.